In 2011, a police officer spotted a woman on a busy street in Japan, and he couldn't believe what he was seeing. He looked at a photo on his phone and then back at this woman and thought, yeah, that's definitely her. He'd been tasked with finding this woman and bringing her back home. It was a pretty basic task, but he'd managed to complete it way faster than he thought he would. The officer rushed down the street, greeted the woman, and she confirmed that yes, she was the person he was looking for. So he led her back to his car, drove her back home, and that was that. However, what the officer could not have possibly imagined was that locating this woman and taking her home was about to unravel 25 years of unimaginable horrors and lead to one of the most bizarre cases Japanese investigators had ever seen. But before we get into today's story, you've likely noticed that we've uploaded this episode on a Friday. This is not a mistake. In fact, this is now our new normal. I'm now going to be uploading 4 episodes to the MrBallen podcast each week. Mondays and Wednesdays will be exclusive brand new stories. Thursdays will be our normal remastered episodes, and Fridays will be a mix of new stories and fan favorites. So, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious, please replace the frosting on the Follow Button's vanilla donut with mayonnaise. Okay, let's get into today's story. Miyoko Sumida raced down the sidewalk in Amagasaki, Japan, trying to will her body to go faster. Miyoko was 63 years old, and she couldn't remember the last time she had run, and her lungs were on fire, and her legs felt heavy. Even though it was a cool day out, she could feel the heavy eyeliner and mascara she always wore starting to run down her face. Every cell in her body was screaming at her to just stop, but she knew that whatever she did, she couldn't stop. She had already waited too long. Miyoko darted across the street and rounded a corner. Ahead of her, the city spread out. In the distance was Amagasaki Castle. It was a white 17th century building with these graceful layers of traditional Japanese curved roofs, and it stood in stark contrast to the rest of the city, which was all low, boxy apartment buildings and factories and warehouses. Miyoko turned a final corner, and there it was, the police station. She ran inside and she called out for help. A police officer came out from behind a window, and in between breaths, Miyoko blurted out the reason she had come. One of her closest friends had gone missing. But the officer just stood there and stared at her calmly and told her to please slow down. And suddenly, Miyoko became aware of what she must look like. A little old frail lady with crazy hair, panting and gasping on the verge of tears. So she tried to steady herself and calm down and start from the beginning. In a shaky voice, Miyoko explained that her next-door neighbor had disappeared. Her neighbor's name was Kai Oe. She was in her 40s, and she was a wonderful, caring friend. But a few days ago, Kai had gotten into a strange car right outside her condominium, and nobody had seen her since. It was like she had vanished into thin air. And so Miyoko worried something terrible had happened to Kai, and now she wished she had come to the police sooner. The officer assured Miyoko that he would file a report and the police would look into this right away. But the officer also said that very likely there was a rational explanation here for why her friend had left. Miyoko began to breathe a bit easier. She told herself everything would be okay. The police would find Kai and bring her home. On November 9th, 2011, a week and a half after Miyoko reported Kai missing, a foreman and his work crew arrived at an old abandoned warehouse in the industrial section of Amagasaki. This warehouse was only a few miles from where Kai had last been seen, but the foreman and his crew didn't know anything about that. They just knew this was where the job they had been hired for was taking place. They were supposed to move some cargo that had been left inside the warehouse to a new location. When the foreman led the crew inside, they saw this vast, mostly empty space with trash and dust on the concrete floor and cobwebs on the walls. There were a few labeled crates scattered around, and so the foreman told his men to start moving them out to the truck. And as the crew took each item out, the foreman would mark it off his list. But then, at some point, one of the workers noticed something tucked away in a dark corner of the warehouse. The worker walked over to it and realized it was this big metal drum. like a barrel that might be used to store oil. At first, he just assumed it was part of the cargo they were supposed to move, so he grabbed it and tried to slide it across the floor. But the drum didn't budge. The worker laughed at himself. He was a pretty strong guy, and he figured he should be able to move a single metal drum on his own, so he took a breath, squatted down, gripped the top of the drum, and tried really hard to pull it out of the corner. But still, it didn't move. A couple of the other workers saw him doing this, and so they joined him in the corner. Together, they all gripped the metal drum and pulled. And it moved, but barely. At this point, the foreman came over to see if he could help, and when he did, he immediately noticed that this drum did not have any markings on it. And he thought that was very strange, because the other items they had come to move had all been very clearly labeled. And so the foreman glanced down at his list, and he did not see the metal drum anywhere on it. This sudden mystery got the crew excited, and they wondered what might be inside of this drum. Maybe there was something valuable or illegal. The foreman thought about just leaving the drum alone, but if it was a valuable item that somehow didn't make it onto this list but was required to be moved, well, the client would be angry if it was left behind. So the foreman told his crew to open the drum to see what was inside. Then they'd figure out what to do with it. The men were all in good spirits and joking with each other as they pulled on the lid, and the foreman could feel his heart beating faster with the anticipation of what they might find inside. Suddenly, the metal lid came loose, and it clanged to the floor. The foreman and his men leaned over the barrel to see what was inside. And for a second, there was absolute silence in the warehouse. As the foreman stared down into the drum, it was like everything around him disappeared. Finally, one of his men let out this awful, strangled scream, and it was like it snapped the foreman back into reality. He fumbled to dig his phone out of his pocket, and then with a shaking hand, he dialed 110, the emergency line for police. Not long after the foreman made that call, the lead investigator on the case, Officer Sato, walked into the warehouse along with dozens of police officers and forensic analysts. The foreman and his crew were still inside, but they had all moved as far away as they could from the drum. Officer Sato nodded at the men, but did not stop to talk to them. Instead, he headed straight for the drum in the corner of the room. And when he reached it and he peered inside, he gave a long, sad sigh. Inside the drum was the twisted body of a dead woman. And there was something else inside of that drum that also horrified Sato. Someone had poured cement inside the drum, and it had hardened and partially encased the woman's lower body. But he could still see enough of the victim to guess that she was probably in her 60s. She had gray hair and wrinkles. Sato could also see that she had bruising on her neck and face, she was completely naked, and she was shockingly thin, almost emaciated. As Sato stared down at the body, he felt his stomach turn. There was a true level of cruelty in the way this victim had been disposed of that hit him hard. But beyond his emotional reaction to this, Sato was also confused, because this scene didn't make sense. It was like his victim didn't match up with his crime scene. If the body of this woman had been found in her home, he could have at least started to wrap his mind around it, because approximately 1/3 of women who are murdered in Japan are killed by current or former intimate male partners. Most of those murders occur inside the home. But this didn't look anything like a domestic violence killing. In fact, Sato could only think of a few instances that involved covering up and abandoning a body like this, and all of those instances were connected to gang violence. In Japan, these gangs are referred to as yakuza, which is kind of like saying the mafia. Sato knew there were yakuza groups in the city. They typically engaged in financial crimes like extortion, smuggling, and prostitution. But there were occasional episodes of major violence, including murder. Still, yakuza violence typically occurred between different gang factions, not between gang members and normal everyday people. And Sato just couldn't imagine how the victim, this older woman, could have possibly gotten mixed up with the local gang. Sato called over a forensics officer. The forensics officer joined Sato and then stared down into the metal drum. He told Sato the bruising on the woman's face and neck suggested she had been beaten before she was killed, and her body had not decomposed much, which could indicate that she had been killed recently. However, they wouldn't know until the autopsy. Sato nodded and then stepped away from the drum and slowly walked around the warehouse, looking for more evidence. He didn't see any blood on the walls or floors, and there also weren't any rope fibers that would indicate the woman had been bound or held captive in the warehouse. In fact, other than the body, there really was no sign of any violence. But that lack of evidence actually helped Sato begin to form an early theory about what might have happened. He believed the victim was most likely murdered somewhere else, and then placed in the metal drum, and then transported and hidden in this warehouse. A few minutes later, Sato headed back to the police station. He knew he really needed the autopsy before his investigation would have a clear direction, because the autopsy would show him who the victim was. However, in the meantime, he decided that the way the body was disposed of was a decent enough lead to get started. The Yakuza had been known to leave their victims in metal drums, so he would start with them. The following day, members of Sato's investigative team fanned out to the dark corners of Amagasaki. So, back in the 1980s and 90s, and even into the early 2000s, the Yakuza had operated pretty openly in certain bars and restaurants. People could always tell the establishments where the Yakuza were running brothels, because there would be a scantily clad hostess at the door trying to entice customers to come inside, and then when those customers stepped through the door, the whole place would be lit with a strange bright pink light. And if they wanted to spend some money, they could go upstairs and pay for sex. But now, the Japanese police had begun a crackdown on Yakuza activities, passing a series of anti-gang laws and targeting different parts of their operations. And so, when Sato's team talked to people in the seediest bars and restaurants in town, they didn't really come up with anything. It seemed like the Yakuza were just laying low, not murdering women and stuffing their bodies into barrels. Sato began to worry that this Yakuza lead was just going to take his team to a dead end. But then, just a couple of days after the discovery of the body, the autopsy results arrived on Sato's desk. Now, the report couldn't answer when this woman had died. It was impossible to tell if she had been dead for days or months. However, the report did give the identity of the victim. Using dental records, authorities had identified her as Kazuko Oe, a 66-year-old woman who had lived in the city. Sato kept on reading the autopsy, and when he finished it, he found attached at the back was this additional report. And when he read this additional report, he was shocked. The report said the dead woman found in the barrel was the mother of Kai Oe, a woman who'd recently been reported missing. But that was not the craziest thing, because the missing woman, Kai, had not been missing at all. A few days after Kai's neighbor, an older woman named Miyoko Sumida, had filed a missing persons report, the police had tracked down Kai, just 20 minutes away in the major city of Osaka. And it would turn out Kai had been hiding out there using a fake name. Very suspicious. And so Sato quickly contacted the officers who'd found Kai, and they told him that when they'd located her, they had no idea her mother was dead. And so there was no connection drawn about perhaps Kai being involved in the death. And since it was not illegal for her to run away and hide out in a different city and pretend to be somebody else, Kai had simply been brought home and allowed to return to her normal life like nothing had happened. Now, Sato's mind began to race. He wondered if the case was really just this simple. Maybe it had nothing to do with the Yakuza. Maybe Kai had just murdered her own mother and then fled. Sato knew he would have to act fast, because Kai had already tried to escape once, and so he didn't want her to catch wind that he was looking for her, or she might try it again. So Sato quickly flagged down another investigator, and the two of them both ran out to Sato's car and sped through the city. When Officer Sato and the other investigator knocked on the front door of Kai's condominium, a short, nervous-looking man in his 40s greeted them. Now, the man was polite, but it seemed fairly obvious that he did not want them to come inside. The man told Sato that he and his family knew about how Kazuko had been found in the drum in the warehouse, and so they just wanted privacy to deal with their grief. But Sato told the man that he really needed to ask some questions, and they could either talk here, in his home, or the man and his family could come to the police station. The man turned around and scanned the apartment behind him like he was looking for something. Then he muttered something under his breath and turned back to Sato and said, "Okay, you can come inside." Sato and the other investigator paused to remove their shoes, then they followed the man into the front room. And Sato couldn't explain it, but right away, he felt like something was off here. He asked the man if he was related to the murder victim, Kazuko, and the man said yes, she was his mother-in-law. But then he quickly corrected himself and said actually she was his former mother-in-law. He was divorced from her daughter, but he still lived in the condo with his ex-wife, their kids, and Kazuko. This surprised Sato. Why would a divorced couple keep living together? But he just smiled and nodded. He wanted to keep the man talking very comfortably. And just because the living situation seemed odd to him, that didn't mean there was anything wrong with it. Eventually, Sato got to the point and asked the man if his ex-wife was Kai Oe, the woman who had gone missing and then returned. The man shook his head. He said he had been married to Kai's younger sister, but Kai actually also lived with them in the condo. The man paused and again looked around the room like he was searching for something. Then he turned back to Sato and just began to laugh. Sato glanced at the other investigator, and he looked as creeped out as Sato did. There was something so strange about this man, and it wasn't just that he clearly was very nervous. A lot of people get nervous talking to the police, so they were used to that. This weirdness was something else. Once the man stopped laughing, Sato asked him if Kai was home, and the man turned and pointed to a closed bedroom door. Sato got up and walked over to it, knocked, and announced he was a police officer and asked if he could come inside. There was a brief silence, and then Sato heard light footsteps from inside the room. And slowly, the door opened. And when Sato saw who opened the door, he had to consciously hide his shock, because the woman standing in front of him looked like a corpse. She was rail-thin, and her eyes seemed hollowed out in her face. Sato could see there were stains on her shirt, and her hair was stringy and greasy, like it hadn't been washed in weeks. He asked her if she was Kai, and she just nodded. Sato stepped into the room, while the other investigator stayed back with the man. In the room, Sato saw there was a plate on the floor with scraps of food on it, and also clothes were piled up in different spots. The room smelled sort of musty, like the door hadn't been opened in a long time. Sato wondered when Kai had last left her bedroom. The silence was broken when Kai said she knew why he was there. She had actually been expecting the police ever since she got the news that her mother's body had been found in that warehouse. Sato asked if she knew what had happened to her mother, and in a voice so quiet that Sato had to lean in to hear her, Kai said, "My mother took her own life." This absolutely stunned Sato. If it was a lie, it was a really stupid one. Because why would Kai expect him to believe that her mother had, put herself into a concrete-filled drum? Or was she suggesting that her mother had killed herself, and then Kai, or maybe somebody else in her family, had then disposed of the body by putting it in the drum? Sato waited for Kai to say more, but she didn't. She just went quiet. Finally, when the silence between them had become deafening, Sato asked her, hey, why'd you run off to Osaka a couple of weeks earlier? Kai seemed to force a smile, and then said the whole thing was a big misunderstanding. She had just gone on a quick trip and was surprised anybody even noticed she was gone. Now, this made perhaps less sense than even the idea that Kai's mother had put herself in the drum, but Sato stayed quiet. He didn't want her to know that he was sort of onto her. He was a big believer in letting people trap themselves through their own words. But before Kai could say any more, Sato heard new voices outside the room, and he turned to see 3 people outside in the front room approaching his other investigator. Kai told Sato that the 3 people were her sister and her sister's young teenage daughters. Sato gestured to Kai to come with him, and then the 2 of them stepped out of her bedroom and headed towards the front room. Sato introduced himself to the rest of Kai's family and then shot another look at his partner like, what's going on here? The sister and the children looked as bad as Kai, like they hadn't eaten or slept in days. And when Sato asked them the same basic questions about Kazuko's death that he had asked Kai, he noticed their eyes dart back and forth like they were trying to communicate with each other without actually saying anything. And when they did speak, they all said the same thing, that Kazuko had taken her own life. Sato felt like this whole situation was just insane. He had arrived here thinking maybe Kai was involved in her mother's death, but now, after seeing Kai and her family and the unsettling way they were all living, he had no idea what was going on here. Why were they all so sickly? And why were they telling such transparent lies? Sato didn't know if these people were guilty or innocent, but he did know one thing for sure. They were hiding something. He told the family they would follow up soon, and then he and his partner stepped outside. And then once they were out there, Sato said to his partner that, hey, while we're here, we should speak to the neighbors to see if any of them have a clue about what is going on inside of that condo. They began knocking on doors, but the neighbors would just say they knew nothing and then quickly retreat back inside. Now, this actually was not surprising to Sato. In Japanese culture, people were often reluctant to speak about other families' lives, especially if that family was doing something illegal or if they were mourning the loss of a loved one. But Sato had hoped he would have at least one opportunity for a helpful interview with a neighbor. He had looked at the missing person report that had been filed about Kai, and he knew that the older woman who filed it, Miyoko Sumida, lived right next door. Now, the investigators had actually already knocked on her door, but she hadn't answered. However, Sato figured they should try one more time before they left. After all, she's the one who filed the missing persons report, and so if anybody had more insight on the family, it would be her. And this time, when they knocked on Miyoko's door again, she did answer. However, she just seemed really scared and quickly apologized and said she had nothing more to say. Sato and his partner were about to just give up and leave when a young couple opened up their door and actually invited the investigators inside. The couple told them that months earlier, they had been out walking in a nearby park when all of a sudden they heard a woman screaming. And when they looked in the direction of the scream, they saw Kai, her sister, and her brother-in-law and their daughters beating Kai's mother, Kazuko. They said they had immediately called the police, but when the police arrived, they barely questioned the family. Instead, the officers had a quiet conversation with the family, left after a few minutes, and never followed up with the couple. This didn't surprise Sato either. At this time in Japan, domestic conflicts were handled very differently than pretty much any other kind of criminal investigation. It came down to the same principle of respect for privacy that made Kei's neighbors refuse to talk to them. Basically, police thought that family problems, even nasty ones, should be dealt with by the family. Sato was disappointed he hadn't gotten more information, but as he and his partner left the young couple's home, his mind began to race. Kazuko had been beaten before she died. There was all that bruising on her neck. And now, Sato knew that Kazuko's own family had been beating her. However, this didn't solve the mystery. In fact, it only tangled it further. Because after seeing Kai and the others in that condo, Sato didn't think they could actually physically carry out all the steps of Kazuko's murder. Kai looked so weak that it seemed like she could barely stand on her 2 feet, and the rest of her family wasn't much better. So how could they beat Kazuko to death, then transport her body to the warehouse and cover it with cement? Sato could not answer those questions, and he didn't even know where to look. The next afternoon, Sato was at his desk trying to figure out his next step when his phone rang. He picked it up, and the man on the other end spoke barely above a whisper, and he said, "I have important information about Kazuko Oe's murder." Sato felt a rush of adrenaline, and instinctively he just stood up at his desk. He asked who the caller was, but the man wouldn't give a name, and Sato didn't want to scare him off, so he didn't press. The man said he didn't know how Kazuko had died, but he was certain that her family was under the thumb of a vicious Yakuza gang. And this particular gang had a ruthless leader, who was perhaps the most terrifying Yakuza leader in the whole city. After that, the caller hung up. Sato stood there in shock. It was like he had arrived back at the very beginning of this case, when he had stood over Kazuko's body in the metal drum and wondered if this was the work of the Yakuza. Sato immediately began a deep dive into the Oe family's finances. He knew that almost all Yakuza crime just came down to money. And right away, a series of financial transactions jumped out at him. Over the past 2 years, the family had made repeated big payments at regular intervals. And when investigators tracked the group receiving these payments, they discovered a connection to the Yakuza. So, Sato began to believe that Kazuko's family had somehow gotten into debt with the wrong people, and Kazuko had paid with her life. And on November 26, 2011, which was just over 2 weeks after the discovery of the body, Sato rounded up 5 known Yakuza members in the area and brought them in for questioning. However, Yakuza members rarely ever talked to the police, so after 5 mostly silent interviews, Sato had no clear evidence linking any of them to the murder. And he still had no idea who this gang's supposed ruthless leader was. So by the time that 2011 ended, Sato had hit another dead end. And soon months went by with no new evidence coming in. And so Sato began to think that he might never know who killed Kazuko. On October 14th, 2012, so 11 months after the discovery of Kazuko's body, a pair of Amagasaki police officers approached an empty one-story house in a residential neighborhood. They were following up on an anonymous tip, very similar to the one that Sato had gotten. From the outside, the house looked like every other house on the block. But the second the officers opened the door, they knew something was very wrong with this place. The faint odor of something rotten filled the front room. The power was out, so the officers turned on their flashlights and headed down a dark hallway. The further they went into the house, the worse the smell got. Towards the back of the house, the officers found a room that was closed off by traditional Japanese sliding doors with wood frames covered in opaque paper. As they approached it, the rotten smell became almost unbearable. They braced themselves and then opened the sliding doors. Inside, they saw 6 large tatami mats made of thick woven straw covering the floor. Traditionally, shoes and socks would be removed before stepping on these mats, but the officers just quickly walked into the room, because they were sure that whatever they were looking for was somewhere inside of here. The rotten smell seemed to be coming from somewhere below them, so one of the officers crouched down, held his breath, grabbed the edge of the mat in the center of the room, and started to pull. And as the mat slid away, darkness opened up beneath it, and the officer shouted to his partner to come look. Under the mat, there was a hole in the floor, and when the officers peered down inside of it, what they saw made them want to run out of the room and vomit. Because at the bottom of that hole, partially encased in cement, were 3 naked, decomposing bodies. These officers quickly alerted Officer Sato, and it didn't take long for Sato to discover that these 3 new victims shared a common link with his original victim, Kazuko Oe. This link was a person who they were all very close to. It would turn out all 4 of these victims had been the victims of the Yakuza. There was a ruthless Yakuza leader who had overseen all of their murders. But Sato would soon learn that these murders were just the tip of the iceberg. This particular gang leader had overseen the murder of multiple entire families over the last 25 years. Based on evidence discovered at several crime scenes and from interviews conducted over the course of a year, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Kazuko Oe. On the night of September 11th, 2011, 2 months before Kazuko's body would be found, the ruthless Yakuza leader reclined on a luxurious couch in a room filled with high-end furniture and artwork. The leader checked the time, and then picked up a phone and made a call. One of the killers answered, and without hesitating, the leader told the killer, "Now." Then the leader hung up, tossed the phone on the couch, and calmly waited. Not long after that, the 2 killers stood outside of Kazuko's bedroom, where she was fast asleep. After a minute, they signaled to each other that they were ready, then they opened the door and rushed Kazuko's bed and leapt on top of her. Kazuko woke up to the sight of fists flying at her face. She tried to fight off the killers, but they had her pinned down, and each punch left her dazed and writhing in pain. She tried to cry out, but she was too weak. The killers brushed away Kazuko's arms as she tried desperately to protect herself, and they kept on pounding her in the face, the neck, and the head, until Kazuko just stopped fighting back. When Kazuko went still, and the killers realized she was dead, they climbed off the bed and backed out of the room. Back in the front room, one of the killers called the leader to say the job was done. But the leader just laughed and told the killers to stay right there, because the job was not, in fact, done. The killers did exactly what they were told. They always did exactly what they were told. They stood there in complete silence, waiting. Finally, the front door opened, and the ruthless Yakuza leader walked into the condominium. The killers led the leader into Kazuko's bedroom. The leader stared at Kazuko's body, and then barked for the killers to move her to the bathtub and cover her with ice. The killers obeyed. And once Kazuko's body lay under a blanket of ice, the leader brought the killers back to the front room. There, the leader told them to write a suicide note, and to make sure the note included Kazuko's last wishes, that Kazuko wanted to leave all of her money, her possessions, and property to the Yakuza leader. The leader then told the killers that the last thing they would have to do was secure a metal drum, so that other members of the gang could transport the drum with Kazuko's body inside to a warehouse. The killers nodded silently. Once the plan was set, the leader smiled at the killers and then turned around and walked back outside, and went right back next door to the condominium where they lived and went back to relaxing on the couch. The ruthless Yakuza leader, who had ordered the brutal murder of Kazuko Oe, and who had presided for more than 2 decades over a secret and twisted reign of terror, was literally the last person Sato or anyone else had expected when this investigation began. Because the leader didn't look like some hardened criminal who could rule people through physical intimidation. Instead, she looked like a kind old woman. Her name was Miyoko Sumida. She was the 63-year-old woman who had rushed to the police to tell them that her neighbor, Kai Oe, had gone missing, and she was so upset about it. But to just call Miyoko a Yakuza leader would be a huge understatement. Miyoko was more like a serial killer and a cult leader. Over the course of their investigation, Sato and his team discovered that Miyoko's introduction to cruelty and brutality had come at a very young age. She grew up in Amagasaki during the chaos of post-World War II Japan, when the country was trying to recover from the devastation of the war. During that time, certain areas of the country bordered on lawlessness, and Miyoko's father had taken full advantage of that. Miyoko's father had been a very successful contractor who brought in North Korean laborers to work for him. He let those workers live in his home and eat his food, but he also beat those workers every day, took 40% of their wages, and threatened to kill them if they didn't do exactly as he asked. And so over time, out of fear and desperation, these men became completely obedient to Miyoko's father. And Miyoko had watched all of this very closely and even had begun to study her father's methods. Then, in her 20s, Miyoko herself entered into a life of crime, using a lot of what she had learned from her father. Her first major foray into the criminal world had been to buy one of those bars with the bright pink lights on the seedy side of the city that offered customers the opportunity to pay for sex. That had allowed Miyoko to meet members of the local Yakuzas and to familiarize herself with their tactics. When she was ready, she sold the bar and assembled a gang of her own. She recruited family, friends, and other people she trusted. Miyoko set out to get as much money and power as she possibly could, and using threats of violence from her gang played a role in her plans. But Miyoko went far beyond typical Yakuza violence to get what she wanted. Because just like her father, Miyoko understood that fear alone was not enough to own people. Her victims, they had to need her. In a way, Miyoko made her victims love her. To do this, she targeted families that owned property or businesses. She infiltrated those families by offering things like financial assistance to help their businesses grow. And at first, people viewed her as a generous benefactor, a kind, wealthy woman who just wanted to help others succeed. But once Miyoko gained a family's trust, she used what some might call mind control to gain power over them. She would start by turning members of the family against each other, causing problems in their house or in their business, and then blaming those problems on one specific family member. And through her financial assistance, Miyoko would start to make that family feel dependent on her to survive, just like her father had done with the laborers. And Miyoko would also use her money as a way to get family members to do favors for her. These favors started out small and got bigger over time. And slowly, the family would grow more and more obedient. And while all this was happening, Miyoko would start to make rules about when a family could eat, when they could sleep, who they could talk to, and when they could go outside. And if any of them pushed back, Miyoko would order her gang to inflict serious physical harm on them. So using these methods, Miyoko was able to completely break people down mentally and physically to the point where entire families were terrified of her and also simultaneously completely loyal to her. And it would turn out Miyoko had used these methods to infiltrate Kazuko's family. That's how she got Kazuko's own daughter, Kai, and other family members to publicly beat Kazuko, like that young couple had witnessed in the park. But Miyoko's demands did not stop with forced beatings. Her ultimate goal was to take everything that family had. Their money, their property, their assets, all of it. And for that to happen, Kazuko would have to die, and then give everything to Miyoko in her will. But Miyoko did not want blood on her own hands. This was the horrifying truth that Sato and his investigators discovered at the heart of this case. Miyoko and the members of her gang did not physically murder Kazuko. Instead, at Miyoko's command, Kai and her sister beat their own mother to death. In manipulating Kazuko's daughters into murdering her and then willing over all her assets, Miyoko had imposed her brutal will, like she had done without consequence for years. But what she hadn't counted on this time was Kai's reaction. Because Miyoko may have thought that she had Kai completely under her control, like she had everyone else, but she was wrong. A tiny part of who Kai was before Miyoko came into her life had survived. After Kai had murdered her own mother, she felt instant regret, and she couldn't contain it. Now, Miyoko had noticed Kai's emotional turmoil, and she knew it posed a risk to her. So, on October 30th, 2011, Miyoko had left Kai tied up and locked in a car alone, debating what she should do with her. But Kai had managed to escape, and that's when she fled to Osaka and began living under a different name. When Miyoko realized that Kai was gone, she ran to the police station and played the hysterical, desperate old woman just trying to find someone she loved. She knew the police would immediately believe her, and she was right. And when the police found Kai, she refused to tell them anything. Remember, she was terrified of Miyoko, but she was also guilty of her own mother's murder. How could she possibly explain her situation to the police? So she just came home. And so by the time Sato visited the OF family condo, Kai had been locked inside of her bedroom, starved, and was getting beaten by her own family ever since her return. And Kai almost certainly would have suffered the same fate as her mother if that work crew in the old abandoned warehouse hadn't gotten curious about the unmarked drum mixed in with the rest of their cargo. It would turn out that over the course of 25 years, Miyoko had infiltrated and destroyed at least 5 families, including the family that was found under the floor. And each time, Miyoko had manipulated members of those families to kill each other or to kill themselves. In the end, police charged Miyoko with 8 murders, but they were only able to recover 6 bodies. And there are a lot of people who believe that Miyoko has been involved in even more murders. Kai and her sister were ultimately treated as victims in Miyoko's crimes, and they were not charged in their mother's murder. In December of 2012, while in prison, Miyoko strangled herself with her own clothes and died in her cell. After her death, Miyoko would come to be known in Japan by names like the Killer Grandma, Piranha, and the Demon. But to this day, some people refuse to believe that Miyoko is actually dead. They argue that she simply used her powers of manipulation to fake her own death and escape from prison. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio, Jordan Stidham, and Cole Lacasio. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Minata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you want to hear more like it, go ahead and check out our YouTube channel, just called MrBallen, where we have hundreds more stories a lot like this one, but most of them are not available on this podcast. They are only available on that YouTube channel, which again is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. One early morning in April of 2012, a man was walking through the woods in coastal France. He lived nearby and he had just seen a column of smoke coming out of the trees in this area, and so he was just coming out here to make sure there was not a brush fire or something. And so he walked through the woods and eventually he reached the source of the smoke. It was in this clearing, and right away he felt relieved because what he saw was just the remains of a bonfire, and it was just smoldering, and now there was just some smoke coming up off of it. He was about to turn around and go maybe get some water and douse it out completely, but he smelled something. Like it was a weird smell that clearly was coming from the fire. And so curious, there's nobody else around, he just began walking to the fire to see what was making this smell. And as he got close enough, he realized there was something in that fire. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the follow button a nice fresh burrito. But don't tell them, instead of using ground beef, you used cat food. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the night of April 26, 2012, a 39-year-old bouncer named Lionel Veronese opened the door of a nightclub in Chambéry, France, and he let a woman inside. And as this woman came in, she stopped and made a point to look at Lionel and smile at him and thank him by name. So Chambéry was a small city up in the Alps, and Lionel, the bouncer, was a fixture in its nightlife scene. Pretty much everybody in town who went out to the bars and clubs had either seen Lionel standing at the door outside or partying inside when he was not on the clock. And it was not just the locals who knew who this guy was. Lionel was also well known among the rich and famous tourists who often vacationed in Chambéry, and even sometimes he would pick up side work as a bodyguard for these rich and famous people. And for Lionel, his career as sort of this fixture in the nightlife scene was fun and pretty glamorous at times. But it also could be dangerous. In fact, just a few months ago, he got into this huge fistfight protecting one of his clients, and in fact, he actually got arrested for it. But tonight, Lionel was just trying to get through a shift without any trouble. There was this long line of people who were waiting outside the club, waiting to get in, and Lionel checked their IDs one by one and let them in. And then finally, when the line started to clear, Lionel saw a familiar face walking toward him. It was his good friend, Mike Boof, who Lionel often went drinking with multiple times a week. And at first, Lionel was just really glad to see Mike. But as Mike got closer, Lionel realized that Mike actually looked really mad. And so by the time Mike actually reached Lionel just said to him, hey, what's going on? You look pretty upset. And Mike would tell him that he had just been at his friend Philippe's house, and Philippe had told him that seemed really, really weird. So Philippe Perrier, Mike's friend, the guy whose house he just came from, was extremely wealthy because his family ran this world-famous winery near Chambéry. Now, Lionel had never actually met Philippe himself, but he knew of him. His family was incredibly well-connected in town because they're so rich and they had this winery. And Mike was friends with him and often talked about him. And so now Mike explained to Lionel what this really weird thing was that he heard when he was visiting with Philippe. So apparently, Philippe's house had been robbed the day before, and Philippe believed Lionel, the bouncer, was the one who had done it. Now, Lionel immediately acted totally taken aback and began to ask Philippe, why in the world would he even think that? But Mike, his buddy here, just cut him off. And he's like, Lionel, don't play dumb. Philippe knows you're sleeping with his wife, Natalie. And Natalie is actually the one who's blaming you for this robbery. Now, at this, Lionel went from this sort of shock and awe reaction to actually just feeling really nervous. He actually began to sweat because, he knew it was true. He had slept with Natalie. He'd met her at a club one night a couple of months ago, and they'd hooked up in the coat check room. But Lionel realistically had a lot of flings with a lot of different women. And he'd actually pretty much completely forgotten about hooking up with Natalie, since it had just been like a casual thing and he hadn't seen her in weeks. And so he had no idea why now, suddenly, she would be accusing him of theft. Like, it doesn't really make any sense to him. So Lionel, he was genuinely stunned. He knew what he had done. He had slept with Natalie, and that's problematic. But he told Mike very truthfully that he did not break into Philippe's house. Like, there was nothing going on between he and Natalie. That was just a fling. It was nothing. Like, I really didn't do this. But Mike, despite, being friends with Lionel and knowing him quite well, did not appear to believe him. He just sort of narrowed his eyes and nodded and said, "Okay, I'll pass that along to Philippe." 3 days later, on the night of April 29th, Lionel sat in a chair in his living room in Chambéry, finishing up a phone call. So he lived in a small apartment with his mother and also his nephew, Julien. However, Julien was just 4 years younger than him, so in many ways they were more like brothers. And so as soon as Lionel hung up the phone, Julien, who was sitting in the room with him on the other side on the couch watching TV, he immediately asked Lionel, "Who were you talking to?" Lionel got up and he walked over and sat down next to Julien on the couch, and then he said to him, "Oh, that was my friend Mike, and he had just called to see if I wanted to go out tonight for a drink." And so Julien's like, "Okay, cool." And then there's a little bit of silence, and then Lionel was like, "Actually, I want to tell you something." And then he filled in Julien on the weird conversation he had had with Mike just a few days before, where basically Mike was saying that, Lionel was being accused of robbing this rich guy's home, Philippe's home. And so Julien, when he heard this, he was sort of like, this seems like a big deal. But Lionel, despite being the one to bring it up and being the one to indicate this could be a big deal, he quickly downplayed it when he saw the reaction and was just like, it is what it is. I didn't do it. And, me and Mike were back on good terms. This whole thing was just, a misunderstanding. Everything is back to normal now. Just a weird thing that happened. And so Lionel and Julien, they shifted the conversation and chatted about whatever for the next couple of minutes. And then Lionel's phone buzzed, and at the same time, he saw there were headlights pulling up outside. So Lionel grabbed his jacket and he told Julien he'd be back in a few hours. Then he went out the door. 2 days later, on the evening of May 1st, 2012, Lionel's nephew, Julien, walked into the Chambéry police station. He had spent the past 2 days very worried and stressed because Lionel had not come home after hanging out with Mike that night, and he now was not answering his phone. And Lionel was never gone for this long without giving Julien or his mother a heads up. Julien had tried to convince himself that he was just overreacting to this whole thing and that Lionel could take care of himself. He was an adult. He was a tough adult, he could handle himself. However, when he found out that Lionel also hadn't been at work for the past couple of days, Julien knew something was wrong. So Julien, after getting inside the station, he walked right up to the front desk and told them, "I need to report somebody missing." The following afternoon, so May 2nd, 2012, Captain Florent Mazarin walked into an interrogation room at the Chambéry police station. He was leading the investigation into Lionel's missing person case, and sitting inside of the interrogation room at the table was, so far, the only suspect they had in this case, Lionel's friend, Mike Bouffe, who he had gone out with on the night he had disappeared. So it had only been a few days since anyone had seen Lionel, but Mazarin was already sure that there was foul play involved. Chambéry was a small town, and a lot of the officers on the police force there knew Lionel, and a couple of them were pretty much adamant that Lionel was just not the kind of person who would just leave town with no warning. Julien, Lionel's nephew, had said the exact same thing when he reported Lionel missing. He also was the one who told police that the last person Lionel was with was Mike on the night he went missing, and Mike also, they found out, had recently accused Lionel of robbing someone's house. So Mazarin was really eager to get in there and hear what Mike had to say. So into the room he went. He sat down across from Mike, who seemed calm but also definitely curious, like he wasn't sure even why he was there. And when Mazarin started in by asking him about the robbery that supposedly Lionel was involved in, Mike just nodded and explained that the break-in had happened about a week earlier at the home of his good friend, Philippe Perrier. And when Mazarin heard that name, he sort of raised an eyebrow, because like basically everybody else in Chambéry, Mazarin knew who the Perriers were. And he was surprised that someone so rich and so powerful would be running in the same circles as, sort of traditional working class men like Mike and like Lionel. However, before he could dive in and ask some basic follow-up questions about how he knows the Perriers, Mike went on to say that he ran an electrician business and he had a warehouse that was right next to Philippe's winery. So they saw each other all the time. And he said that Philippe knew Mike was friends with Lionel, and so after this break-in and robbery happened, he had asked Mike to talk to Lionel about it because he was suspicious that he had done it. But Mike said when he actually confronted Lionel just a few days ago and brought up the break-in, that Lionel had sworn he didn't know anything about it. And Mike had passed that on to Philippe, and as far as he knew, that had been the end of it. Like they were not going to continue to assume that Lionel had anything to do with it. Now, Mike was being so earnest as he told the story that Mazarin thought there was a good chance he was simply telling the truth here, and that this robbery thing was really just a big misunderstanding. However, when Mazarin asked Mike where he had been on Sunday night, when Lionel was last seen, presumably with Mike, Mike's whole demeanor changed. He began to visibly shift in his seat and began looking down at the table instead of eye contact with Mazarin, and then he just said that he had been home all night with his girlfriend. He did say at a certain point he had called Lionel to try to make plans with him for that night, but they'd never actually met up and they didn't see each other. Now, at this point, Mazarin was pretty confident that Mike was lying, not just because of Mike's very obvious change in body language, but Lionel's nephew had sworn he had seen Mike's car outside their building on that night that Mike is saying he did not meet up with Lionel. Now, it was possible that Julien had been mistaken, but if Mike was lying to the police about having been with Lionel on the night he disappeared, well, that made Mike seem very, very suspicious. And so Mazarin just put Mike on the spot and said, okay, give me your girlfriend's name and her contact information so I can confirm your alibi. And so he did, he handed it over, and then Mazarin got up, left the interrogation room, and went to go give her a call. On the evening of May 2nd, 2012, so just a few hours after questioning Mike Bouffe about Lionel's disappearance, Captain Mazarin drove up to a big house in a quiet, wealthy suburb just outside of Chambéry, France. Now, by this point, he had already spoken to Mike's girlfriend, who had confirmed what Mazarin was already thinking, which was Mike was lying about spending the whole night of Lionel's disappearance at home with her. In fact, she said that Mike hadn't been home at all. She said she had been at home by herself all night. She had watched a movie, and then at some point she had fallen asleep, maybe around midnight. And at that point, when she fell asleep, Mike still was not back from wherever he was. So right now, Mike was not only their sole suspect, but he was also their best suspect. Mazarin knew that a few days before Lionel's disappearance, Mike had confronted Lionel about this supposed robbery at Philippe Perrier's house. And so now Mazarin was at Philippe's house to see what he had to say about the whole situation. And so Mazarin pulled his car up in front of the house, he parked, he got out, he walked up to the front door, and he rang the doorbell. And a moment later, Philippe himself opened the door. And he seemed genuinely surprised to see Mazarin standing there. And so he quickly asked Mazarin if he was here to follow up on the robbery investigation. And Mazarin said, sort of. Mazarin said, for now, he just wanted to know if he could come inside and they could chat. And for a moment, it seemed, at least to Mazarin, that Philippe sort of hesitated, like he didn't necessarily want to do that. But then he sort of relaxed and nodded and said, sure. And he let Mazarin inside. And so Mazarin, he stepped inside of this beautiful house that was very well furnished, and he was led to the living room. And Mazarin took a seat, and then after Philippe sat down as well, he asked Philippe to walk him through what had happened with this supposed robbery. Philippe explained that his wife Natalie had come home one afternoon, and when she had come into the living room, she saw one of the windows had been shattered. And then Mazarin said that, after seeing this, they searched the house and they eventually went downstairs to the basement where their safe was, and they found their safe had been broken into as well, and a lot of cash that had been in there was gone. Philippe said he had called the police about it and they'd come out to investigate, but so far he hadn't heard anything. And so Mazarin, after hearing this, asked Philippe if he thought he knew who was responsible. And Philippe immediately nodded and said yes. Then he repeated what Mike Booth had said. It was Lionel Veronese. And the reason he knew that was Lionel was having an affair with his wife Natalie, and Natalie said it was Lionel. Mazarin looked really hard at Philippe because this was huge. If Philippe knew that Lionel was having an affair with his wife, that gave him, Philippe, plenty of motive to want Lionel dead. And as of right now, Lionel was gone and no one knew what happened to him, so maybe he was murdered. And so, operating on a hunch, Mazarin followed up by asking Philippe if he had any weapons in the house. And to his surprise, Philippe said yes. And so Mazarin asked if he could see them. And so Philippe got up and led him over to the stairs that went down to the basement. And when they got down there was this huge gun safe with a few plastic firearm cases stacked around it. And so Philippe, once they got down there, he sort of stepped out of the way so that Mazarin could look around. And almost as soon as he did begin walking around Mazarin and began opening up these cases, he discovered that one of those cases, which had space for 2 weapons in it, was empty. And so Mazarin asked Philippe, hey, where are the 2 guns that go in this case? And Philippe said, actually, those were stolen during the robbery. However, after hearing this, and as Mazarin is staring at this empty gun case, something just was not adding up. Philippe clearly had a motive to want to hurt Lionel, as he was having an affair with his wife. And he happened to have 2 missing guns? Now, of course, at this point, Mazarin did not know if Lionel was definitely, dead, and therefore couldn't know if he had been shot or not. But still, this was really suspicious. But at the same time, Philippe was from this very wealthy and highly respected family. He didn't really seem like the kind of person who would go around murdering or kidnapping people in revenge. And if he had, let's say, done something bad to Lionel, it was just odd that he would just so readily admit to clearly having a motive to harm Lionel and to show the detective a basement full of weapons, including a gun case that was missing weapons. And so, basically, until Mazarin was able to figure out what actually happened to Lionel, until that time, he would have a really hard time proving that Philippe had anything to do with it. The next morning, Captain Mazarin was in his office at the police station, going over the notes from his interview with Philippe to see if there was anything he missed. At this point, Mazarin's theory was that either Mike or Philippe, or maybe even both of them, had gone to confront Lionel about the affair and about the robbery, and then things had turned violent. But just then, there was a knock on his door, and Mazarin turned and he saw his door was open, and there was this woman standing there, and her face was stained with tears, and when she walked into the room, she sort of was heavy and stumbling, like she was maybe on drugs, or maybe drunk, or maybe on heavy medication, and she sort of stumbled into the room and then introduced herself as Natalie Perrier. So Mazarin had actually earlier called on her to come in and speak to him, both to verify her husband's story about what happened, the robbery, the affair, and also to see what else she might know about Lionel. And also, since she clearly was involved in this whole potential love triangle here, he had to also consider her as a potential suspect in whatever happened to Lionel. So he gestured for Natalie to take a seat, and then once she had, he asked her to tell him all about how she had met Lionel. Natalie, at this point, really clearly could not sort of keep herself together. She kept apologizing and kept explaining that she was on prescription medication that made it really hard for her to keep a grip on her emotions, and this whole situation had really rattled her. But eventually, after this sort of setup about how sorry she is and what a mess she is, she eventually tells Mazarin that she had met Lionel at a nightclub and that, yes, they had hooked up a few times, but since the last time, they hadn't seen each other, and it had been quite a while, like it was nothing. When Mazarin asked her about the robbery, she said that Lionel had told her about having serious gambling debts from playing poker, and so because of that, she had just sort of naturally suspected that he must have robbed them. She also added that, just to be clear, her and Philippe were both at their home all night on the evening that Lionel disappeared, and that if Philippe had gone to confront Lionel at any point, she did not know anything about it. And so at this point, Mazarin sat back in his chair and just considered what he was seeing and what he was hearing. Natalie seemed genuinely devastated by this whole situation. To Mazarin, it seemed like she was believable, that she was coming in here telling the truth. And so he really doubted that she directly had anything to do with Lionel's disappearance. However, while Natalie's emotional state certainly made her seem less likely as a suspect, Mazarin wondered if maybe her tears were a clue. By her own account, she'd only had a fleeting relationship with Lionel, not some, passionate relationship or something. So maybe the reason she's this upset is because she actually knows that her husband was involved in what happened to Lionel. A few days later, Captain Mazarin walked through a wooded rural area near the coast, 220 miles away from Chambéry. An officer from the Marseille police was walking a few steps ahead of him. This officer had called Mazarin yesterday to tell him that a body had been discovered in these woods just after dawn on April 30th, so less than 10 hours after Lionel was last seen by his family. And after running the body's fingerprints through the database, they had identified the victim. It was Lionel. And Mazarin was baffled by this. Marseille was more than a 4-hour drive from Chambéry. And as far as Mazarin knew, Lionel didn't know anybody in Marseille and did not go there with any regularity. And there was just plenty of other wooded areas closer to Chambéry. So why drive all the way out here? It just didn't really make any sense. And so Mazarin continued following this officer, and at some point, they stepped into this small clearing, and Mazarin saw there was a pile of burnt logs and branches sort of lying in the grass right in the middle, and the other officer said that this was the spot where Lionel was found. And then the officer pulled out a folder that had photos of Lionel's body. And so Mazarin was being brought here just to see exactly where it had been found. And so Mazarin looked down at the photo, and what he saw was, in this spot that he was standing near, there was this smoldering bonfire. It was clearly out, but there was still smoke coming off of it. And then in the middle of all these logs was clearly a charred corpse. The officer that brought him here explained that the medical examiner had found a gunshot wound in the back of Lionel's head. So it did appear that he was actually killed before he was set on fire. And so as Mazarin was taking all this new information in, everything just started to make sense. So this was exactly how drug trafficking gangs in France typically disposed of bodies. The police even had a name for it. They called it a barbecue. The gangs would shoot their victims in the head and then burn their bodies over a bonfire to make them harder to identify. Mazarin had assumed that Lionel's murder was a revenge killing. But now it actually looked more likely that this could have been a gang execution. None of Lionel's family or friends had ever mentioned that he was involved with a gang in any way, but Mazarin knew that Lionel worked in nightclubs and had a history of breaking up fights, so it was definitely possible that he might have crossed paths with the wrong person. Also, there was the fact that apparently Lionel had these huge debts from gambling. There's just sort of a seedy underworld that potentially he was around that could have led to him being killed this way. Also, if this was gang-related, it would sort of explain why he was all the way out here in Marseille, because Marseille was a city that historically had a lot of issues with drug trafficking and gangs. And so Mazarin realized he could have been wrong about this case basically from the start. Maybe Mike and Philippe actually had nothing to do with it at all. Around 10 p.m. on May 5th, 2012, about 100 miles from the spot where Lionel's body was found, Captain Florent Mazarin pulled into the parking lot of a gas station. He got out, he walked inside, and told the clerk that he needed to look at the security camera footage. So during the 4-hour drive from Marseille back to Chambéry, so after Mazarin had gone out and seen where Lionel had been found, during that ride home, he had been going back and forth between his first two suspects, Mike and Philippe, and this new theory that a gang had killed Lionel. And so he wasn't really sure how he was going to navigate, what to do here with running these two sort of simultaneous investigations. But as he's driving, as he's on his way back home, he realizes there might actually be a way to prove whether or not either Mike or Philippe were involved in this killing. There were only 2 roads that connected Chambéry to Marseille, and so Lionel's killer or killers must have driven down one of them at some point during the night of April 29th. So Mazarin had been checking the cameras at every toll booth and every gas station that he passed on his drive to see if any of them had captured a glimpse of Lionel. So far, he'd just been disappointed because most of the cameras didn't even work, or the footage had already been erased or written over. And so now, as he followed this clerk into the back room and was shown to their computer to go ahead and look at the footage, Mazarin was expecting that this stop would be the same as all the others, a big disappointment. However, as soon as they fired up the computer, right away Mazarin saw that they did have footage, and the footage did cover the time period he was looking for. However, when he began scanning the footage around the date of April 29th, April 30th, at first nothing stood out. However, when he reached the early hours of April 30th, where he would normally stop and say, okay, I didn't see anything, it is what it is, for whatever reason, he decided to just keep on scanning the footage, just keep on watching more of April 30th. And eventually, he did see something of interest. At 5:43 a.m. on April 30th, a black Volkswagen vehicle pulls into frame, and it actually parks in the gas station parking lot. And this car, its license plate ended in 73, which meant this car was registered in Chambéry. He's watching this car, comes into the lot, it parks, and the driver gets out. And right away, Mazarin pauses the video and he zooms in on the driver's face, but the video was just too grainy. He couldn't tell who the driver was. But then something in the passenger seat of this car catches his attention. And so he zoomed in on the passenger seat, and when he realized what he was looking at, his stomach just dropped. Based on that video, forensic evidence, and interviews with witnesses, this is what police believe happened to Lionel Veronese on April 29th, 2012. Around 10:15 p.m., the killer sat in the back seat of a car as it drove through the streets of Chambéry with a gun resting on the seat next to them. Now, the killer had told the driver that they were not planning to use the gun tonight, it was just there for intimidation. However, the killer's emotions were really running high, and they honestly weren't even sure what they were going to do when they saw Lionel. And so the car kept on driving along until eventually it came to a stop outside of an apartment building, and then a few seconds later, the passenger side front door opened up and Lionel climbed inside the car. As the driver put the car back into gear and started driving down the road, the killer from the back seat confronted Lionel about something that had really been bothering them. And it gradually turned into a very heated argument, and then, at some point, the killer raised that gun they weren't going to use, aimed at the back of Lionel's head, and fired. The driver immediately whipped around and looked at the killer and just stared at them. They seemed completely shocked by this crazy sudden escalation here, but they didn't stop driving. Instead, they stepped on the gas and sped down the road until they reached a house. And then the killer and the driver both went inside of that house and they formulated a plan for what would happen next. So the plan was the driver, along with another accomplice who was in the house they went to, would drive down to Marseille, they would find a secluded spot out in the woods, they'd make a bonfire, and they would burn Lionel's body. That's how they dispose of it. And then on the way back, their plan was to toss all the evidence into the river. As for the killer, the one who actually pulled the trigger, they were going to stay at this house. They were not going to leave. The driver and the other accomplice agreed that the killer had already caused enough trouble for one night. So the killer just went upstairs into their bedroom, they slipped on a robe, and they watched from the window as the other two got into the car and drove off. The killer was Philippe's wife, Nathalie Perrier, the woman Lionel had had an affair with. To Lionel, their affair had been meaningless, just a fling. But for Nathalie, she wanted more. She'd gotten bored of her quiet life as a luxurious housewife in the suburbs, and she'd quickly fallen in love with Lionel and the seemingly very exciting life that he lived. And so when Lionel stopped paying attention to her, she'd gotten so mad that she took revenge. She went with Mike to pick up Lionel on the night he was killed so that she could confront him. But moments after Lionel got in the car, her emotions got the best of her, and she shot and killed him. And this was definitely not the plan that Mike had agreed to. Like, he and her had discussed what was going to happen. It didn't include murdering Lionel. But after the murder, Mike didn't say, I'm going to go to the police. Instead, he and Nathalie went to her husband, Philippe, for help. And Philippe agreed to dispose of Lionel's body and cover up the crime. On the security footage from the gas station, what Mazarin saw in the passenger seat of that black Volkswagen was Philippe. He was sitting there, just right in the passenger seat, and it would turn out the driver of the car was Mike. Nathalie was ultimately convicted of Lionel's murder and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Mike was sentenced to 6 years for kidnapping and destroying evidence, and Philippe was sentenced to 3 years for helping get rid of Lionel's body. He and Natalie are now divorced, and also as for that robbery that played seemingly a central role in the story at the beginning, we actually don't know if the robbery ever occurred or if it was simply a fabrication. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Lacasio. This episode was written by Kate Gallagher. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today, I'm going to tell you 2 stories about people who basically unknowingly risked everything just to travel to their dream locations. And they didn't realize they were in danger until it was already too late. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So if that's of interest to you, please promise the follow button a luxurious trip to Paris, but don't tell them you're sending them to Paris, Texas. Okay, let's get into our first story, which is called Baggage Claim. On the morning of Monday, January 7th, 1985, a 31-year-old man arrived at an international airport in order to board his flight to the United States. The man was very nervous. His heart was beating fast and his palms were sweating so much that he could barely hold the handles of his very heavy, tan-colored suitcase. And the reason he was so nervous is because he was feeling very conflicted about what he was about to do. On the one hand, this trip was something he'd been dreaming of for months, and it was supposed to represent the start of a great brand new life. Now, this man hadn't actually packed very many personal items to take with him. But one thing he had brought was a little bound book full of photographs, which showed what mattered the most to him. And what mattered the most was waiting for him in America. But on the other hand, the man was terrified, because before he could begin this brand new life, he had a huge problem he needed to take care of. And that problem was why he needed to drop off his very heavy suitcase without anybody looking inside of it. And so now, inside the airport, the very nervous man stopped and readjusted his grip on the suitcase handles, and then made his way over to the ticketing area, where he would check his bag for his almost 11-hour flight to California. And then, once he touched down and they landed in California, he could get off the plane, go to the baggage carousel, and get his luggage, and then everything would be fine. Now, of course, he knew this was a big gamble. If it had been possible, he would have just brought this bag with him on the plane to stow it in the overhead bin, but he just couldn't do it because the bag was too big, too heavy. And so really his only other choice, if he wanted the suitcase to make it to California, was to check it like he was doing, because the alternative was leaving it behind, and there was no way he was going to do that. He cared far too much about what was inside of this luggage. And so by the time the man actually got in line in the ticketing and baggage check area, he was so stressed out that he was beginning to feel physically ill. By the time he got to the front of the line, he still felt very sick, but he composed himself enough that he walked up to the counter of the airline he was traveling with, which was Lufthansa Airline, and the employee who was working behind the counter was very cheerful, and they greeted the man and took his passport to verify his information. Then the employee put down the passport and then reached out his hand and gestured for the nervous man to give him his very important suitcase. This was, of course, the moment the man had feared the most, when everything could really go astray. But as calm as he could, he lifted up the suitcase, and for a second he almost panicked because it was just so obviously heavy. He realized the employee might make him open it right there because it just seemed wrong that this suitcase was that heavy. And he knew if that happened, he was done for. He'd be arrested immediately. But instead, the employee just dragged the heavy suitcase over to a conveyor belt behind the counter, and the nervous man watched as the employee heaved the suitcase onto the belt, and the man kept his eyes locked on the suitcase as it rolled down the belt and then disappeared through a pair of rubber flaps at the very end. He was so focused on the bag, he almost didn't notice the airline employee returning to try to hand him his boarding pass for the plane. Finally, the employee literally just waved the ticket in the man's face to get his attention, and it kind of snapped him out of it, and he took the boarding pass, and as calmly as he could, he thanked the employee, and then he turned and hurried off to catch his flight. About 12 hours later, on the other side of the world, another employee of Lufthansa Airlines walked around the baggage claim area at Los Angeles International Airport, which is typically just called LAX. It was about 2 p.m. Los Angeles time, and the employee was working in the international terminal. It was his job to monitor the circular carousels where passengers picked up their luggage after their flights, and his job was to make sure no bags were left behind. And as he was making one of these loops, he noticed there was a tan-colored suitcase with soft sides sitting all alone on one of the carousels. The employee stopped and checked the monitor above the carousel to see the last time this carousel had been used by an incoming plane, and it was quite a while ago. And all the passengers clearly had come through and picked up their luggage, except for this one lone bag. So, based on the timing, the employee figured that, this bag must be unclaimed. But this was not remotely concerning to him. Luggage went unclaimed all the time. Sometimes because bags were sent to the wrong airport, or because the suitcase's owner missed their flight, or even just forgot to get it. But whatever the reason was, it was this employee's job to simply start the process of identifying the owner of the suitcase. So, like he always did, he walked over to the carousel and grabbed the suitcase handle and went to pick it up. But when he did, he let out a sort of surprised grunt and stumbled because the suitcase was so much heavier than he had expected. So he went back and he grabbed the handle with a better grip this time with two hands and braced himself and yanked, and the suitcase kind of toppled over and fell off the carousel onto the floor. And this was also around the time that the employee noticed that this really heavy suitcase had no tags on it. And so now this bag did seem very unusual. The extreme weight and no tags, that's not normal. So he knelt down and he began to unzip the suitcase to see what was inside. He was legally allowed to do this because unclaimed bags at airports are subject to search. But he had only unzipped it a little bit before he froze, and for a second he just stared in shock at what was inside of the suitcase. But then he immediately got to his feet, just left the bag there, and ran to go find a phone to call the police. A little less than 2 hours later, around 3:45 p.m., Detective Don Ravens of the Los Angeles Police Department's Pacific Division stood in the baggage area of LAX's International Terminal, looking down grimly into the tan suitcase that was lying open on the floor. He was surrounded by officials from the LAPD, as well as the FBI, who had all been called to the airport because of what was found inside of the suitcase: the dead body of a young woman. Detective Ravens was shocked. He guessed this woman was maybe less than 30 years old, and judging by her features and dark hair, he thought she could be from an Asian or Latin American country. But that was about as far as he could get, since she didn't have any identification with her, and there were no tags on the bag. There were also no obvious wounds on her body, so he couldn't immediately tell how she died. Ravens spent some time speaking to airline and airport employees, including Customs, which is the government agency that's in charge of inspecting bags that are coming in and out of the country. And he was puzzled as to how a suitcase with a body inside of it had somehow cleared customs. But an agent explained that they didn't actually open up all the suitcases, which meant whoever checked this bag through customs had taken a huge risk, because realistically, they could have been searched and then the body would have been found. So this suggested a certain level of desperation. But apparently this risk this person took to check the bag had paid off because the bag had gone all the way to California. But despite that, Ravens didn't find much to go on here. At this moment, the victim was a Jane Doe, which meant there was no identification for her. And Ravens knew she could really be from anywhere in the world, despite, his snap judgment that perhaps she was from an Asian or Latin American country. And because LAX was an international airport, whoever checked this bag and potentially even put her into the suitcase could now be anywhere in the world too. Once Detective Ravens and the other investigators had finished examining the body as it was found inside of the suitcase, they didn't actually pull her body out. They sent the suitcase and her body to the coroner. Hopefully, an autopsy would turn up evidence that could tell Ravens and the other investigators who this Jane Doe was and what happened to her. The following day, on Tuesday, Ravens sat down at his desk and he opened up a manila folder he had been given. Inside of it was his Jane Doe's autopsy report. And when the detective began reading it, he couldn't help but feel sick, because what he was reading told him that this poor woman had died a horrible, torturous death. The report said the woman had bruises all over her body, like the kind you would get from repeated heavy blows delivered over a period of at least several hours while she was still alive, and her actual eventual cause of death was ultimately suffocation, which meant she either was suffocated and then put into the suitcase, or was in the suitcase, trapped inside of there, and suffocated. Ravens put down the report and leaned back in his chair and just sort of thought through what he had just learned. Based on the autopsy, he now knew this poor woman had died a brutal, awful death, but the coroner had not found any identifying information or anything on her that would give away or help to give away who she actually was or who did this to her. So really he had very little here other than knowing this lady suffered. Ravens had spent the last 24 hours poring over all the surveillance footage from the airport security cameras, looking for any suspicious passengers leaving without any luggage. But nothing had jumped out at him. He had also interviewed a bunch of airport employees who would have been in the baggage claim area on the day the body was found, but none of them had noticed anything strange either. And so, despite it only having been one day since this woman was found, Ravens was already worried that this case was going to go cold. But what Ravens had not counted on was the huge amount of publicity his Jane Doe would generate. The TV news, as well as the newspapers, were reporting feverishly on the body that was found in the LAX suitcase. And by Wednesday, so 48 hours after the body was found, the reporting had made it all the way to Peru, where a man named Juan Espinoza contacted authorities to report that the body might actually belong to his wife. Officials in Peru called the LAPD, and Juan's report ended up on Ravens' desk. Ravens opened up that report and began reading. Juan and his wife lived in Peru's capital city of Lima, but his wife had been trying to leave Peru to escape poverty. She had left their home hoping to basically sneak into the United States so she could get a job there and then send money back to her family in Peru. She had promised Juan that she would contact him when she arrived in America, but after she left, Juan said he never heard from her. This report felt like a promising lead to Ravens. Juan and his wife checked a lot of boxes, especially because, Ravens' Jane Doe had features that indicated she could be from a South American country like Peru. And so Ravens wondered if Juan's wife had tried to get into America by using a human smuggler, which is someone who transports immigrants across borders illegally. Human smuggling was obviously an unregulated industry, and Ravens knew smugglers could be very violent or reckless, and the people they were transporting often had no protection. Meaning, sometimes when people would go to these smugglers to try to get help to go to these other countries, sometimes the smuggler wouldn't help them. They would just rob them, or in some cases, rob them and then kill them and dispose of their body. And unfortunately, again, because there's no regulation or oversight, a lot of times these horrible crimes would just go unnoticed. And so maybe if that's what had happened to Ravens' Jane Doe, it would explain why the tags were ripped off the suitcase. The smuggler who, committed this crime would not have wanted to leave any ID on or around the body that could be traced back to them. And so Ravens picked up his phone to call the LAX airport operations manager to see if he could get the logs for any flights coming from Peru to LAX on the day the body was found. And that was when he discovered there was a big problem with this theory, because there were no flights from Peru. The only flights that day that used the luggage carousel where the body was found were from Korea, Japan, and Germany. And there weren't any flights that originated in Peru that had layovers in those countries either, which meant it just wasn't possible that his Jane Doe was Juan's wife. And so now Ravens was stumped all over again. He had almost no evidence to go on. All he really had was the suitcase and the body. And the actual crime scene itself was maybe somewhere in Korea or Japan or Germany. And so Ravens really didn't have a good idea of where he should begin looking for more evidence. But then he got an idea. Detective Ravens got up from his desk and headed straight to the evidence room. He put on a pair of disposable gloves, and he found the box that contained evidence from Jane Doe's case, and he opened it up. And there really wasn't much. All that was in there were, pieces of jewelry and some clothing that were found on the woman's body. And all of it had already been examined for trace evidence like blood or hair. However, blood and hair were not what Ravens was looking for. One at a time, he lifted out each of the sealed plastic bags that contained Jane Doe's belongings until he got to her blue sweater. He took the sweater out of the plastic and he turned it over in his hands and then checked inside the neckband. And there he found exactly what he was looking for. Immediately, he felt a rush of adrenaline. He was onto something here. And so he reached back into the box and he grabbed another plastic bag with a pair of gray pants in it. And he did the same thing. He looked at the waistband. Then he opened a third bag and he checked inside of her blouse. And each time, his hunch had been right. Jane Doe's clothing had labels sewn into them. And the labels were clearly written in some language that was not English. Ravens wasn't sure, but to him, he thought maybe the letters looked Middle Eastern. It didn't take long for the FBI to help Ravens and the LAPD identify the origin of Jane Doe's clothing. All of it had been made in the Middle East, in Iran. This meant that finally, Detective Ravens had a likely country of origin for his Jane Doe. But he also had another problem now. Really, he had the same problem he'd had when he thought his victim was from Peru. And that was that there were only 3 international flights that his Jane Doe could have been on. And none of them originated in Iran. And there were no connecting flights from Iran that day either. And so Ravens needed the public's help. On Thursday, so 3 days after the body was found, he and another detective sat down with a reporter from the city's newspaper, the Los Angeles Times, a publication that's read all over the world. And Raven and this other detective's goal was, to give as many updates as they could about the case, hoping that somebody somewhere would read the story, recognize a detail, and come forward. However, that's not really how the interview played out. By the end of it, Ravens was feeling pretty discouraged by all the questions he and his partner just couldn't answer. In fact, the last thing he said to the reporter, which ended up getting printed as the sort of last line of the story, the lasting impression, if you will, was, "Don't be too surprised if you never find out where she came from or who she is." The next morning, Detective Ravens got to his office and had barely taken off his coat when his phone rang. A police officer from Sacramento, California was on the other line, and he sounded all worked up. He told Ravens that he knew that, the LA investigators had been working on the airport Jane Doe case, and even though it wasn't going anywhere, he knew it was a big deal for them. But he told Ravens that he actually had this unbelievable development in Northern California that was connected to the airport Jane Doe case. He said authorities in Northern California had just found another body. But when Ravens heard this, his first reaction was not excitement that there was new evidence or something. It was confusion. He didn't need another body. He needed to find his Jane Doe's name. And so he asked the Sacramento officer, what he meant. Had they found another woman in another suitcase or something? But the Sacramento officer said no. The body belonged to a man, and this guy's name had never even been on police radar. He had died from a gunshot wound, 400 miles away from Ravens' Jane Doe, but the officer said that the story they had uncovered behind this new body would likely solve Ravens' Jane Doe case. This is the story that the Sacramento officer told Ravens. On the evening of Monday, January 7th, just a few hours after Jane Doe's body had been found at LAX, a man named Hadi had picked up his friend and roommate, a 31-year-old man named Mahmoud Ayazi, at the Sacramento airport, which is about 400 miles north of LAX. Hadi was excited to see Mahmoud, who'd been away for a few weeks. They were good friends, and Mahmoud was always very optimistic and fun to be around. But on this day, when Mahmoud got in his car, Hadi immediately noticed that his friend seemed sullen and quiet and just very clearly upset about something. And so Hadi asked him what was wrong. And Mahmoud just said, "Oh, I'm sick with the flu." But to Hadi, Mahmoud did not look very sick. He looked worried and kind of jittery and nervous. And as they started to drive, he kept looking out the windows and out the back of the car, like he was nervous about somebody following them or something. And when they got back to their apartment, Mahmoud went straight to bed. And for the next 2 days, Mahmoud continued acting increasingly weird and paranoid. He asked Hadi to disconnect the phone in their apartment and said he didn't want to see any of their mutual friends. He also kept looking out the windows of their apartment, but whenever Hadi asked what was wrong, Mahmoud refused to explain. Then, sometime before 6 a.m. on Thursday morning, so now 3 days after Hadi picked Mahmoud up from the airport, Hadi woke up to the sound of the front door of his apartment opening and then shutting. So it felt way too early for Hadi or Mahmoud to be up, and they also lived in a city where break-ins were unfortunately not uncommon. So the sound of the door opening was enough for Hadi to get out of bed and go make sure everything was okay. But when he got to the door, he did not find an intruder or something. He found Mahmoud in the process of leaving the apartment. Hadi asked his friend, where are you going? But Mahmoud just shook his head and said he was simply going out. And so there was really nothing Hadi could do. He couldn't stop Mahmoud from going out, so he watched his friend leave, and then Hadi went back to bed. But as he was in bed, he had this sick feeling in his stomach that something bad was about to happen. About 2 hours later, somebody called the Sacramento Police Department to report finding a dead body in the driver's seat of a car in a parking lot. The dead man had clearly died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound, and on the passenger seat next to the body were 2 Iranian passports and 1 Lufthansa Airlines plane ticket. When the Sacramento police officer finished telling Detective Ravens the story, he said he believed that one of the passports that were found in the car with the body belonged to Ravens' Jane Doe. He said he would send it over that afternoon by courier so Ravens could make a positive ID. And when the passport did arrive, Ravens was able to finally give his Jane Doe her name back. She was a 20-year-old Iranian woman named Katan Safawi. And after investigators searched Mahmoud's apartment, they would find another piece of evidence that would actually explain why Katan Safawi had ended up beaten and pummeled and asphyxiated to death in an abandoned tan suitcase in LAX. The evidence was a little bound book, and it was full of photographs. Back on January 7th, 1985, Mahmoud very nervously dropped off the tan suitcase that contained Katan at the international airport and then boarded a Lufthansa flight to LAX. He was traveling from Frankfurt, Germany, one of the 3 cities that had flights into LAX that day that specifically used the carousel where the body was found. But Mahmoud's trip had not started in Frankfurt. It had started in Iran. But his travel plans had gotten all messed up, and he'd gotten stuck in Germany for several days. And so this was him finally getting out. But he was insanely nervous about this leg of the trip because of what was in his suitcase. He had expected to feel much less worried once he had successfully checked the suitcase and got his ticket and boarded his flight. But when he did all that, and when his plane took off, Mahmoud only got more and more anxious. Every time the plane hit even the tiniest amount of turbulence, he wanted to scream from the anxiety. But finally, the flight landed at LAX, and as soon as it touched down, Mahmoud got off as fast as he could and practically sprinted to the baggage carousel where he would pick up his suitcase and then board another flight to Sacramento. But when he got to baggage claim and he picked up his suitcase, he knew immediately something was wrong. With a shaking hand, he unzipped the suitcase, and when he looked inside, he felt a wave of grief and horror that was so powerful he almost fainted right there. Because the trip that Mahmoud had been dreaming of for months, that he was returning home from now, was a journey to his home country of Iran to get married to the woman he loved, Katan. And now, inside the suitcase, was the dead body of his new wife, Katan, who Mahmoud had been trying to smuggle into America to start their new life together. Katan had run into issues with her visa in Frankfurt, and officials wouldn't let her board the plane to America. And so Katan and Mahmoud tried for days to fix this problem, but it became clear that only Mahmoud would be able to actually enter the United States, not Katan. And so ultimately, Katan willingly got into that suitcase. Mahmoud had not murdered her, or at least not intentionally so. She hadn't been trafficked or anything. She chose to get in that suitcase. Together, they decided that they would smuggle her in the cargo hold of the plane, and that's how they would get her to the United States. But during the flight, when she had boarded, she had been totally alive. But when she was in the cargo hold, other luggage had fallen and piled on top of her and slowly crushed her to death. And so when Mahmoud got to LAX and opened up the suitcase and saw what had happened, He panicked. He pulled the tags off the suitcase and left the suitcase and just got on his flight to Sacramento. And then once he landed there, he was so overcome with guilt and grief that 3 days later, he took his own life. When police searched Mahmoud's room, they found the little bound book full of photographs that he had so carefully packed for his trip to America, and those photos were of his and Katan's wedding. The following week, Mahmoud and Katan's bodies were sent back to Iran via the same route they had taken to get to Los Angeles. But this time, they traveled together. The next story is called Cold and Calculating. On the morning of December 11, 1960, a 27-year-old man named Leonid Rogozov stood on the deck of a Soviet ship that was sailing across a freezing ocean at the very bottom of the world. Up ahead, finally, he could see the enormous, desolate white landmass of Antarctica, a continent that was too brutally cold for human civilization to last at scale. Basically, nobody lived there except for like a handful of scientists and other people who were researching the area, like Leonid. Antarctica was about to be Leonid's home for the next year and a half. And Leonid, he looked around him on the deck of the ship at the other 11 men who made up his team, and he smiled. They were all part of what was called the 6th Soviet Antarctic Expedition, and they'd been sailing for 36 days, all the way from Leningrad, Russia, to get here. Their job was to get to Antarctica, disembark, and then travel nearly 50 miles inland over brutal terrain, where they would eventually build a brand new scientific research facility from the ground up, and then they would stay there and begin studying the local climate. Leonid and the rest of the men had been chosen for this expedition because they all had specific skills that the team needed. Leonid was a meteorologist and also knew how to drive this special all-terrain vehicle that they'd brought on the ship. There were a few other meteorologists on the team, as well as several engineers and other scientists, and also one of the men was a doctor. Their work was part of a larger Cold War-era effort by the Soviet government to expand scientific research and knowledge. So Leonid saw this job both as a way of having this big adventure and also as a way of serving his country. And so he ultimately felt proud to be here. But as he was actually looking at the vast emptiness of Antarctica right in front of him for the first time, the reality of the situation they were in began to dawn on him, and he began to feel a jolt of fear. Everything on this expedition had to go exactly right, or he and the other men's lives would be in danger. I mean, this is not a safe place for people. They were arriving in a place with literally zero infrastructure, and they only had about 2 months before the polar winter was going to hit Antarctica, which meant they had to construct the entire research facility and make sure it was polar winter-proof in those first 2 months, because that was their shelter. And just to make the stakes clear, if they didn't get it done in time, or if the structure was flawed in some way, they would almost certainly die. When the polar winter came, temperatures would drop as low as negative 140 degrees Fahrenheit, and the ocean would literally freeze solid. The closest help would be about 1,000 miles away and could take weeks or even months to arrive. And their only way to contact the outside world was with this long-range radio that was not always reliable. So essentially, Leonid and these 11 other men that made up this expedition, they were going to be completely isolated, with nobody to rely on except each other, until their scheduled pickup, which was in April of 1962. Again, a year and a half later. So now, when their ship docked on the coast of Antarctica, and the captain called out for everyone to start unloading the ship, Leonid hesitated, and so did some other men. I mean, this was it. This was the real start. But one at a time, they began grabbing their supplies and climbing down a ramp on the side of the ship. Leonid watched his fellow scientists step onto the snow, and as he did, he sort of shook off his own fear as a moment of weakness. Right now, he needed to be strong. And ultimately, I mean, Leonid was a very strong-willed person. He had been born in a remote village in eastern Siberia, so he knew he could handle the isolation and the extreme cold. He had already done that before. He was also the son of a World War II veteran who had died in combat. And his father had taught him to soldier on at all costs, even under the toughest circumstances. So right now, that's what Leonid did. He soldiered on. He took a deep breath of the ice-cold air, then grabbed his things, walked down the ramp, and stepped onto the snow with the others. And then once they had everything they had packed for the next 16 months off the ship, The crew on board the ship still wished all the men good luck, and then they lifted up the ramp. And then Leonid and the rest of the team watched as that ship began sailing away, leaving them all alone for the first time. At first, things at the new Antarctic Research Center went pretty well. Leonid and the team successfully built the entire research building in time before the polar winter, so when the worst weather came, they were able to hunker down inside and be safe. They'd also set up a whole bunch of atmospheric measurement tools that allowed them to study the Antarctic climate exactly as they wanted to. So by April, 4 months after getting dropped off by that ship, and now only about a month or so into the 6-month-long polar winter, the men, for the most part, were really just trying to stay warm, conserve their supplies, and gather data. However, they hit their first real snag on the morning of April 29th. Leonid woke up in his bunk that day with a stomachache. When Leonid woke up, he had that pain in his stomach, but he felt nauseous and so weak that he could barely roll over inside of his bed. And this really concerned Leonid, because getting a stomachache back at home was one thing, but getting a stomachache in Antarctica was totally different. For one, there was a huge blizzard going on outside that was making both land and air travel literally impossible, which meant that even if Leonid radioed for help, nobody would be able to get to him for a very long time. And to make matters even worse, at their research station, they didn't have access to most of the regular medical treatments that would have been available back at home. Basically, if this stomachache was anything serious, Leonid could die. As a result, Leonid would basically not allow himself to even consider the possibility that this stomachache was serious. Instead, he told himself that, he must have just eaten something weird. They were all living off of rations of preserved food, and so he figured he must have gotten a bad batch of something, and maybe he just had a mild case of food poisoning. So he dragged himself out of bed and he went to the kitchen for a glass of water to hopefully settle his stomach. But when he got there, he saw 2 other men, another meteorologist and an engineer, who were sitting at a nearby table having breakfast, and they took one look at Leonid and immediately asked him, hey, are you okay? And Leonid didn't want to worry them because, again, any medical emergency is a huge deal here for everybody. So he quickly forced a smile and said, oh yeah, everything's fine. Then Leonid quickly grabbed his glass of water, chugged it down, and made his way back to his bunk. And when he got there, he didn't just climb back in bed. Instead, he grabbed some clean clothes and a towel and then walked down the hallway to the shower stalls. And he turned one on as hot as it would go and then got inside. However, before he could even wash his hair, his vision began to go blurry around the edges and his ears began to ring. He felt like he was about to faint, and he quickly sat down on the floor of the shower so he wouldn't fall and hurt himself. And as he was sitting there with his head spinning and the hot water raining down on him, the dull, aching pain in his stomach suddenly sharpened. It was like a horrible, stabbing pain ripping through his stomach now. Leonid barely had time to wrap a towel around his waist and rush to a toilet before he began to vomit. A few minutes later, Leonid stumbled into a small storage closet where the research team kept a reserve of basic medications like pain relievers and antibiotics. Leonid took some antibiotics and tried to power through the day, but that pain in his abdomen just got more and more intense. Eventually, he told the other men on his team that he really had to stop, lie down, and rest, that something was wrong here, but maybe if he just lays down long enough, it'll go away. Leonid would spend the entire evening going back and forth from his bed to the toilet because he kept vomiting, and he didn't sleep at all that night. And by the next morning, April 30th, Leonid was in so much pain that he really couldn't even try to hide it anymore. He was still vomiting, he was still very dizzy to the point where he could barely stand up, and he could tell he was also running a very high fever. However, what really scared Leonid the most was what his belly actually looked like. He had not been able to keep any food down for the last 24 hours, so he knew his stomach was completely empty, and yet he was so bloated that his belly was sticking out like a balloon. And so lying in bed, feeling feverish, nauseous, and dizzy, and looking down at his grotesquely swollen abdomen, Leonid had to admit to himself that this was definitely more than just food poisoning. Something was very wrong, and he needed help. The scientific research team's doctor took stock of all of Leonid's symptoms, and he immediately came up with a diagnosis. And the diagnosis was simple, but the treatment was not. Leonid definitely did not have food poisoning. He was in a life or death situation. This was a very serious thing. But to save him, the doctor was going to have to perform a surgery that had only ever been done successfully 2 times in all of history. And that was because this surgery required a very risky technique that most doctors refused to even try because it was so dangerous, both to the patient and also to the doctor. Basically, Leonid was likely going to die if the doctor attempted the surgery, but Leonid was definitely going to die if he didn't. And so ultimately, a decision was made that the doctor would give it his best try. At least that way, they were trying to save Leonid's life, even if they were unsuccessful. At 2 a.m. that night, so technically early morning on May 1st, the doctor took a deep breath and mentally prepared themselves for this surgery. Leonid was lying on a makeshift operating table inside the research center. He was wearing a surgical gown, and despite the fact he was about to undergo real surgery here, he was wide awake, because he had to be. Due to the nature of this incredibly risky and rare surgery, the doctor couldn't actually give Leonid any real anesthesia to knock him out. Leonid had to be wide awake and fully aware for this entire procedure, which meant all he could get were some local anesthetics, which sort of dulled the pain but did not get rid of it. The doctor looked over at the 4 other research team members who were in the operating room. There was a driver, a meteorologist, and 2 aerologists, which are scientists who study the Earth's atmosphere. Now, none of these 4 had any real medical training, but the doctor needed assistance to do this operation, so he'd recruited them to help him out. Leonid had his head propped up with pillows, and his knees were turned to the left, so he was twisted into a position where the lower right side of his abdomen was facing up towards the ceiling. The doctor had already cut a hole in his hospital gown, so Leonid's swollen stomach was visible. And now, through that hole, the doctor injected Novocaine, which is a type of local anesthetic, right into Leonid's abdomen. And then once the Novocaine took effect, the doctor used a scalpel to carefully make a 4-inch-long incision into Leonid's lower abdomen. Leonid took in a sharp breath, but he did his best to stay perfectly still. The incision began to bleed heavily, and one of the assistants came over and used a pair of metal tongs to spread open Leonid's skin and muscles and fat, revealing Leonid's internal organs. At this point, the doctor was so nervous that his hands began to shake, but he took a deep breath and slowly cut his way with the scalpel through the protective membrane that surrounded Leonid's organs. But as he did, he accidentally poked a hole in Leonid's large intestine, and Leonid noticed right away because he began gushing blood. And when the doctor realized what he'd done, he sort of began to panic, and he began yelling for the assistants to hand him his surgical sewing kit. And when they did, he kind of clumsily began trying to sew the hole shut. But by the time the doctor had finally closed up the wound, Leonid had already lost a lot of blood. And the real problem, the reason the doctor was doing this surgery in the first place, still had not been solved. Like, the surgery had not really even happened. We just had this incision, that's it. And so the doctor knew he really had to hurry before Leonid bled out. And so he threw his standard operating procedures out the window. He just had to go for it here. So he just took one of his hands and reached inside of Leonid's abdominal cavity and started literally feeling around, trying to find the source of Leonid's illness. But as he did, it was like all the blood drained out of Leonid's face. I mean, he's feeling this. This must have been horrific. His body went limp and his head kind of rolled back on his pillow. And this was actually the exact moment that this surgery truly became its most dangerous. Not just for Leonid, but for the doctor too. Right as Leonid's head rolled backwards, the doctor felt himself go weak, and suddenly he was seeing stars. And this was because Leonid and the doctor were actually the same person. In addition to being a meteorologist and a driver of that special vehicle, Leonid was also a recent medical school graduate, and he was the one doctor at this research station. So Leonid was performing surgery on himself. He had given himself that Novocaine shot, and then forced himself to stay still as he carved a 4-inch-long incision into his own abdomen, accidentally slicing into his intestines that he had the wherewithal to then stitch up as he's bleeding to death, and then he shoved his own hand into his abdominal cavity. But it was at that point that Leonid actually looked like he might die, because he began to show signs like he was going to pass out, likely from blood loss or just shock. But he'd given his assistants specific instruction on what to do if he passed out during the procedure. They were supposed to inject him with a specific drug mixture and then give him CPR until he woke up. But just as one of the assistants readied the needle to inject into Leonid because it did appear like he was about to pass out, Leonid suddenly sucked in a huge breath and his head snapped back up. Leonid, with his hand still inside of his abdomen, told his assistants that he was okay. Then he looked over at the mirror that one of his assistants had been holding up this whole time so that he could see what he was doing during the surgery. And with a combination of the mirror and just sort of feeling around inside of his own body, which must have been horrifically painful, Leonid finally found the thing that was making him so sick. It was his appendix. This entire time, Leonid had been suffering from acute appendicitis. Then he cleaned out his abdominal cavity with antibiotics and then sutured up the entire incision. When he was finally all done, Leonid examined his appendix that he had cut out of himself, and he saw there was this dark, diseased-looking spot right on the bottom of it. Leonid estimated that if he had not removed this thing, it very likely would have burst in less than 24 hours, and that definitely would have killed him. Within just 2 weeks, Leonid was back up on his feet and helping out at the research center like normal. And when the whole team went back home to the Soviet Union in April of 1962, so about a year after Leonid's self-surgery, he was greeted like a hero. The government actually gave him a medal called the Order of the Red Banner of Labor, which was for extraordinary contributions to Soviet society. And he would go down in history as the third person to ever perform a successful auto-appendectomy. And he did it outside of a real hospital with no other trained medical professionals anywhere nearby. And that's actually not the only way that Leonid's legacy lived on. Today, some countries actually require doctors who are stationed in Antarctica to undergo preventative appendectomies just so that they will never be in a situation like Leonid. Because it turns out the one thing you really can't bring to Antarctica is your appendix. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Story editing by Evan Allen. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio, Perry Crowell, and Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts, or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. On a crisp fall morning in 2007, a small airplane took flight over the forested town of Graham, Washington. The pilot was a detective with the Pierce County Sheriff's Department, and he was flying a somewhat unusual mission. He wasn't looking for a lost person or chasing a fleeing suspect. Instead, he was circling the sky above the scene of a double murder case that had him and his whole department stumped. The detective had run out of ideas on the ground, so he decided to take flight. Plus, he always thought better in the air, and he figured, while he was up there, he would literally get a new perspective on his evidence this way. He eventually circled over the house where the homicides took place, and then also began to kind of loosely circle the neighborhood. And that's when he noticed something. It was something that he wouldn't have noticed on the ground, but from up here, it was incredibly obvious. With a rush of adrenaline, he turned his plane around and headed back toward the airfield. He now had a real hunch, and if it was right, that means he just solved the case. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the Strange, Dark, and Mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please tell the follow button you want to show them something funny, then put a mirror directly in front of them. Okay, let's get into today's story. On a Sunday morning in October of 2007, 30-year-old Brian Mock stood just inches away from his TV set, anxiously watching the Seattle Seahawks football team line up on the goal line about to run a play. His living room was filled with friends who'd come over to watch the game as well, and who were there to eat the eggs and bacon and biscuits and gravy that he'd cooked. On TV, the quarterback suddenly threw the ball to the wide receiver, but the pass was intercepted, and the living room erupted in boos and groans. Brian turned and kissed his 28-year-old wife, Beverly, anyway. Win or lose, Brian and Bev were still diehard Seahawk fans, and in fact were actually season ticket holders. And when the Seahawks were playing on the East Coast during away games like today, they would always invite their friends over for a breakfast watch party, because the games would start on the East Coast at 1 p.m. Eastern, and then on the West Coast where they were, that would be 10 a.m., hence the breakfast watch party. Brian and Bev loved hosting their friends. It was exactly what they had imagined doing when they bought this house a year earlier. The couple had gotten married about 18 months ago, and so they still were very much in their honeymoon phase. They lived in this modest ranch-style home with a nice front porch on the rural outskirts of Graham. They had 5 acres of land with breathtaking views of Mount Rainier out back. The neighborhood was sparsely populated. There was only one house close by with plenty of wide open space in between. Their closest neighbors lived in a trailer across a field behind their house. It was perfect for the couple. They were both very outdoorsy, not really cut out for typical office jobs and that kind of life. On their days off, they loved doing things like taking scenic rides on their motorcycles or kayaking in the Puget Sound. But no hobby trumped the pure joy of watching their beloved Seahawks play. The first half of the game came to an end, and Brian walked out of the living room and into the kitchen, where he topped off his cup of coffee. As he stood there drinking it, he noticed the kitchen trash was full, so he put his coffee down and grabbed the bag to take it outside. Brian walked to the bins out back and tossed the bag of trash inside, then turned to walk back into the house. As he did, he heard a car rumbling down the road. He looked up to see his neighbor, Daniel, sitting in the passenger seat, and the two men exchanged a quick wave. Daniel and his wife were the ones who lived in that trailer across the field, and like most of the residents around here, they enjoyed the quiet and mostly kept to themselves. But they were perfectly friendly. But just then, from inside the house, Brian heard somebody yelling angrily. Instantly, he knew it had to be his friend, Randy Holmes, and as he thought that, he felt a pit form in his stomach. Randy was clearly slurring his words, which was not out of character. He was only invited to this party because he was cousins with one of Brian's close friends. He could be okay, but he was young, just 21 years old, and a very heavy drinker. This was not the first time he'd come over and gotten belligerent. Bev also was not fond of Randy, and she and Brian also knew that Randy had actually been in trouble with the law before. They just didn't know the specifics. But Brian did still let him come over for parties, so as not to make things awkward with his cousin. So Brian picked up his pace and ran inside to see what was going on. In the living room, the mood was obviously tense. Randy was standing in the middle of the floor, yelling at no one in particular. Everybody else was giving him a wide berth, trying not to provoke him further. When Randy got like this, it was impossible to reason with him. Randy pointed at Brian's friend, Justin, and shouted drunk nonsense like he was deliberately trying to start a fight with him. Brian stepped forward, putting himself between Randy and the other party guests, and he told him to chill out, but that only set Randy off. Randy stumbled toward Brian, cursing and swaying on his unsteady feet until they were chest to chest. Then Randy shoved Brian. Not hard though, since he was too drunk to put any real power behind it. Besides, Brian was a big guy, and he wasn't exactly easily moved. In fact, if anything, the shove just sort of knocked Randy off balance. And Brian seized the opportunity to grab him by the arms and literally drag him across the living room to the front door. And when they got to the front door, Randy just kept on shouting, and Brian had to physically push him outside into the yard, and then he told Randy to just go home. Randy kept on cussing and yelling at Brian, but he also seemed to realize that he was physically outmatched here. He spit on the lawn and then gathered himself and ambled back to his car. Brian watched him weave his way off the property and drive down the street toward his own home, music blasting out of his car windows. The moment Randy was out of sight, Brian exhaled, his body full of adrenaline. He'd seen Randy pretty bad, but never that combative before, and it sort of unnerved him. He shook his head, wondering what set Randy off in the first place. Brian turned and walked back inside. The second half was about to start, and he hoped the Seahawks would start playing a bit better and maybe take his mind off what had just happened. That evening, Bev felt exhausted as she and Brian picked up after the party. She didn't have the stamina to fully clean the whole house, but she at least wanted to get all the beer cans and booze bottles into a recycling bin, maybe do a few dishes before bed. She told Brian she'd put on some music while they tidied up, and then she went to go grab her phone, which she had left in the kitchen all day charging. But when she got to the charger was still plugged into the wall, but her phone was gone. She called for Brian, asking if he had seen it, but he leaned his head into the kitchen and said no, not since earlier when it was charging right there on the counter. So he offered to help her find it. But as they began to tear apart the living room looking for her phone, a sinking feeling settled in Beverly's stomach. Randy had been in the kitchen a few minutes before his drunken outburst. Bev sighed and turned to Brian and asked him if Randy had used their bathroom while he was over. Brian shrugged and said, yeah, at least once or twice. He was here for a few hours. Bev sighed again. She was willing to bet that Randy very likely had been casing their new house while he wandered down the hallway to the toilet. Maybe he was taking things. She told Brian he better go check his hunting equipment. Then she ran into the bedroom and flipped open her jewelry box. And thankfully, nothing was missing. But Brian soon appeared in the doorway, very pale in the face, and said one of his guns was gone. And so now it became very clear that, Randy had probably taken the gun, taken her phone, and who knows what else. Bev asked if maybe they should just call the police. She was already scared of Randy, but now knowing that he very likely also stole from them, including a firearm, what's to say he wasn't planning to retaliate after Brian threw him out of their house? But Brian said no, we can't do that. Randy was a live wire. It was probably best not to confront him, especially not with police. Besides, everybody at the party was drinking. Maybe the gun and the phone were just misplaced. They should just finish cleaning the house in the morning, and very likely everything would turn up then. 6 weeks later, on the evening of Friday, November 16th, Brian packed up some of his hunting equipment so it'd be ready for the morning. Then he went to brush his teeth before bed. He had plans to go hunting before sunrise with his friend Justin White and wanted to get to bed early so he'd be well rested. Brian and Bev still hadn't found Bev's phone or Brian's gun that disappeared during that party. At this point, they were both certain that Randy had stolen both items, but they weren't sure how to get their stuff back without involving the police or making things awkward with Randy's cousin. So they had agreed to wait a bit longer and just see if Randy tried to return the items with some kind of flimsy excuse. In the meantime, Bev was okay without her phone and Brian had other guns. So Brian crawled into bed and soon his wife joined him. And in just a few minutes, they were both fast asleep. Around 5 a.m. the following morning, Brian's friend, Justin, pulled his SUV into Brian and Bev's driveway, ready to pick up Brian for a morning of hunting. However, the house was completely dark. Justin couldn't see any lights on inside. For a moment, Justin did just idle there in the driveway waiting, taking the last few swigs out of his tumbler of coffee. But he'd been up for a while already, so he was wide awake and pretty anxious to get to their hunting spot. He thought about going up to the door to knock, but he knew if he did that, he very likely would wake up Beverly, since, it was the weekend and it's 5 a.m., so she very likely was asleep. So instead, Justin just let his headlights shine in through the front windows, figuring that if Brian was awake by now, he would see the light and come outside. But after about 5 minutes of that, when still Brian had not come outside, Justin decided this was a lost cause, and he pulled out of the driveway. He figured his friend must still be asleep, so Justin decided he would go hunting alone that day. He drove to the woods on the outskirts of Graham, and as he did, he kept checking his phone. He figured Brian would wake up any second, feel bad, and ask him to turn around and come pick him up. But the call never came. And then when Justin actually got to the hunting spot and was walking around out in the woods, he kept checking his phone, but still there was nothing. And then once the sun began to creep over the tree line, Justin started to get worried. By this point, Brian definitely should have been up, and it was weird that he hadn't called Justin to at least apologize for missing the trip. Finally, after a few hours of unsuccessful hunting, Justin walked back to his car and just called Brian, but there was no answer. At this point, something in his gut told him to go back to Brian's house to check on his friend one more time. Justin pulled into Brian and Bev's driveway for the second time that morning, and it looked like the house had not changed at all. No lights were on, the cars were in the same spot, it was all the same. And so Justin hopped out of his SUV and headed to the porch to ring the doorbell. But when he got to the top step, he looked down and noticed that one of the wooden panels on the door looked like it had been kicked in. He hadn't noticed this earlier, but it had been dark out, so maybe he hadn't seen it. And then Justin heard something coming from inside the house. He peered through one of the windows into the living room, and he realized the noise was coming from their TV set. And he saw something else too. It sort of looked like a pile of blankets on the floor. This was strange. Bev and Brian were always very neat and tidy, and so it was unlike them to leave blankets strewn around. So Justin squinted, trying to get a better look, and as he did, he realized he was not looking at a pile of blankets. In a panic, Justin ran for the door and tried it, but it was locked, so he rushed to his SUV, grabbed his phone, and called 911. Moments later, a Pierce County Sheriff's Department deputy was driving through Graham in his patrol car when a call from dispatch came over the radio. They requested assistance for a possible injured person at a house on 70th Avenue East. This deputy happened to be in the area, so he said he would go check it out. It took him less than 10 minutes to get to the address. As he pulled up, he saw a man standing in the driveway next to an SUV rubbing his hands together. The man seemed very nervous and began to approach the deputy's car. The man introduced himself as Justin and began kind of stumbling over his words as he recounted that morning. He said he pulled up to the house and it was dark, and then he circled back after a fruitless hunting trip, and his voice shook when he explained what he saw when he came back, that he could actually see somebody lying on the floor inside the house. The deputy told Justin to stay put and not to follow him into the house. Then the deputy placed a hand on the holster of his gun and crept up the front stairs. He knocked on the front door, eyeing the broken wood panel that Justin had mentioned. When there was no response, the deputy pushed the door open and stepped inside the house. Immediately, he saw a long trail of blood that led from the front door into the living room. This was clearly way too much blood to just be somebody's simple injury. This very likely had to be a crime scene. The deputy grabbed his radio and called the sheriff's department for backup. Then he unholstered his gun and began moving slowly, following the blood trail into the living room. The trail led the deputy to a bloody sheet lying on the floor. An arm and a leg protruded from underneath the sheet. The deputy looked at the outline of the lumpy mass underneath the sheet and saw it was clearly too big to just be one person. He knew he was looking at two bodies, dead on the floor. Now, the deputy knew, obviously, this was going to command his attention at some point, but for now, he needed to search the house and make sure there wasn't anybody here, like the perpetrator or perpetrators. And so with his gun drawn, he searched the whole house. And when he was satisfied that the house was indeed empty, he made his way back to the driveway to wait for backup. He also wanted to get more information from Justin. However, when the deputy got outside, he was surprised to find that the driveway was empty. Justin White was gone. About 10 minutes later, Detective Sergeant Ben Benson pulled up outside of Brian and Beverly Mock's house. Benson was a 23-year veteran of the force and the lead investigator. He arrived on the scene with one of his team members, Detective Jason Tate. The two detectives climbed out of their car, and Benson gave Tate a very encouraging nod. Tate had just made detective a few months ago, and this would be his first major homicide case. Benson surveyed the neighborhood, or what he could see of it, given how dispersed it was. He told Tate to take a walk around to get the lay of the land, and then start trying to reach the victim's family. Tate nodded and headed down the street. Meanwhile, Benson headed up the driveway to Brian and Beverly's home. A police team was already making the perimeter of the house with yellow caution tape. Benson dipped under the tape, and a deputy came down the driveway to meet him. The deputy told him that he was the one who responded to the 911 call. He motioned to the open front door and said that Brian and Beverly Mock's bodies were inside. Benson headed for the door, and the deputy followed. He told Benson about Justin White, the friend who had called 911 and then disappeared while the deputy was investigating the house. He said it just felt weird. Justin had seemed so concerned about his friend's well-being, but then didn't stick around to see if they were actually okay. Benson thanked the deputy. It was a good lead, one he had every intention of pursuing after he assessed the crime scene. Inside the house, a forensics team was already busy collecting evidence. Benson pulled on a pair of disposable gloves as he followed the trail of blood from the front door to the two bodies piled in the living room. There, he knelt down and lifted up the edge of the sheet that was covering them, and he was met with a grisly scene. Brian was face down on the ground, wearing jeans and a t-shirt. Bev was on top of him, but completely naked, and they had both clearly been shot repeatedly in the head. So it was no wonder the floor around the bodies was completely soaked in blood. There were pools of blood, smudges, and smears. It looked like someone did a poor job of trying to clean up. And when they couldn't sop up the mess, they just sort of covered the crime scene with a few blankets. Benson looked down at the trail of blood, which clearly had been created when the killer dragged Brian or Beverly from the front door into the living room. But the trail sort of looked strange. The blood was streaked with these long, thin lines. You couldn't imagine what had caused them. Benson moved around the living room looking for clues. Forensics had already found an imprint of a shoe in the pool of blood beneath the sheet, right by Brian's body. But otherwise, there were no footprints in the house. As Benson walked through the house, he began to notice blood smears in odd places, like on light switches, and there was a bloody smear on the door jamb leading into the bedroom. It looked like the killer tried to clean up the scene, but then ended up making a bigger mess in the process. And yet, for all the carnage, nothing else in the house was amiss. None of the drawers had been ripped from the dresser, the jewelry box looked untouched, there were plenty of valuables just lying around the house still. I mean, this clearly was not a burglary gone wrong. The killer had enough time to wander around and get blood smears everywhere, but apparently had no interest in stealing anything. Benson circled back to the living room, where forensics was still dusting and photographing the scene. He looked over at the kicked-in front door. The killer clearly was not let into the home, which meant they were either a stranger to Brian and Beverly, or someone they didn't want to let inside. All things considered, Benson's money was on the latter scenario. Someone that Brian and Beverly knew, but didn't trust, who showed up at their house, kicked down the door, and killed them. And given that Beverly was naked, Benson also had to consider the possibility that she was sexually assaulted as well. There was a lot of anger in this murder. It felt personal. But the question was, who wanted Brian and Bev dead? An hour later, Detective Benson pulled his car up to the house of Justin White. The house looked quiet, and Justin's SUV was in the driveway, so he appeared to be home. Benson walked up to the front door and knocked, and a moment later, Justin opened the door, looking pale. And his first question was, are Bev and Brian okay? Benson paused for a moment, and then told Justin that he likely already knew the answer to that question. Justin just sort of swallowed hard, but didn't respond. So Benson asked him why he fled the scene so quickly after the deputy arrived. Justin's voice trembled as he explained that he just couldn't stay there, not after what he'd seen or what he thought he'd seen on the floor inside the house. Brian was one of his best friends. He couldn't believe that something could happen to him. And then once the deputy showed up, it all just seemed too real. He just couldn't handle it, and so he panicked and drove off. He said he regretted leaving, but he just couldn't seem to turn the car around. Benson listened to this skeptically. On one hand, it was suspicious that Justin essentially fled the scene. But on the other hand, Benson knew that in high-stress situations, people did weird things, and sometimes they made themselves look really guilty out of just fear or panic. In Benson's experience, the best way to find the truth was to look for physical evidence that either corroborated or contradicted the stories they told. So, as Justin spoke, Benson scanned his hands and forearms, looking for any marks that maybe Brian or Beverly left. The crime scene he had just left was bloody and violent and brutal. I mean, the killer was very likely to show some signs of a fight. But Benson couldn't see any cuts or scratches on Justin. He wasn't sure what to think, but just to be safe, Benson told Justin he would likely have more questions for him in the coming days. By the time Benson got back to the Mock's home around noon, their quiet investigation had turned into a full-blown circus. The whole neighborhood was swarming with cops. Also, reporters from several local media outlets were stalking the street, asking for interviews with basically anyone who would give them the time of day. Benson did his best to dodge the journalists until he could duck under the yellow caution tape and retreat up the Mock's driveway. His partner, Detective Tate, was on the front porch to greet him, and he told Benson that he had just had a phone call with Beverly's mom, who supplied him with a viable suspect, a guy named Randy Holmes. Apparently, Brian and Bev thought that Randy stole a phone and a gun from their house about 6 weeks ago, the same day that Brian had to physically eject Randy from their party. Bev's mom said that she urged Beverly to go to the authorities, but the couple hadn't wanted to. But according to the mom, Randy always made Beverly nervous. To Benson, this all sounded like a motive. He told Tate, "Great work." That's when a uniformed officer approached Benson and Tate, saying that one of them needed to come talk with the neighbor who lived in the trailer at the edge of the Mock's property line. He apparently thought he saw something last night and wanted to help with the investigation. Tate knew that was his cue, and he told Benson he would call him with a report. Then he followed the officer across the field toward the trailer in question. Meanwhile, Benson headed back into the office. He wanted to learn whatever he could about Randy Holmes, including if he had a criminal record. It didn't take long for Benson to discover that not only did Randy have a record, but it was pretty extensive. Before the age of 21, Randy had been arrested for a litany of crimes, including possession of a stolen vehicle, forgery, and violating a restraining order. And that last one was of particular interest because it suggested that Randy could be capable of violence. Benson grabbed the phone on his desk and called Detective Tate. He told Tate that Randy was looking like a pretty good suspect, and he wanted to go and find him. Tate agreed and thought that was a good idea, and he also told Benson that he had some news too. He had just wrapped up an interview with Daniel and Jennifer Tavares, the husband and wife who lived in the trailer across the field from Brian and Beverly, and the couple said they didn't know the Mocks very well, but David said he did see something strange at the Mocks house that morning. Around 7 a.m., Daniel said he had heard gunshots outside. There were a lot of hunters in the area, so gunshots were sort of common this time of the year, but he said he was still curious, so when he heard them, he'd peeked out his blinds towards the Mock's house in time to see two men run out of Brian and Beverly's home, jump into a red pickup truck in the driveway, and peel out. Daniel said he did get a really good look at one of the two men. That guy had a ponytail that was tied back, and his face was pockmarked and scraggly, like he hadn't shaved in a couple of days. As for the second guy, Daniel said he really didn't get a good look at him, but he could see enough to know that it definitely was a man. And so after saying all this, Tate followed up and asked Benson, hey, does that description match Randy? Benson thought for a minute. The photo he had seen of Randy did not show Randy having long hair or a pockmarked face. But, Daniel didn't get a good look at the second guy, and so maybe the second guy could have been Randy. Either way, such a detailed description would definitely help them figure out if Randy was their guy or involved. Benson told Tate to wrap up what he was doing and head back to the station. They had a suspect to track down. About 40 minutes later, Benson and Tate pulled down a dark residential street in Graham, looking for what they hoped would be Randy's home. Randy had given multiple different addresses over the years during different arrests, so Tate and Benson were going to try all of them, starting with the most recent. They squinted out the windows looking for house numbers, and for a moment they thought they found his home, but then realized the number on that house had an extra digit. It took 2 more sweeps of the street for Benson and Tate to realize that, in fact, none of the house numbers on the street matched the address Randy had given his arresting officers. So either the booking officer had made a mistake, or Randy had given a fake address. Tate looked down at his notebook, where he'd scribbled all of Randy's known addresses. He wondered aloud how many of them would be phony. But Benson, he just sighed, and said this gave him even more reason to suspect Randy. Everything about this guy was sketchy. The second address on their list took them to a real house, which was promising. But when they knocked on the front door, a middle-aged woman answered. She admitted to being Randy's mom, but said she hadn't seen her son in days, and she had no idea where he was. She looked genuinely concerned as she asked if he was in some kind of trouble. Benson felt bad for her. It seemed like this was definitely not the first time cops had come around looking for her son. So he handed her his card and told her he just had a few questions for Randy about a case they were working on. Randy's mother took it and promised to call if her son showed up. Back in the car, Benson pulled on his seatbelt. Meanwhile, Tate crossed off Randy's mother's address and rattled off the next house to try. Under the circumstances, it was bad news that not even Randy's mom could find him, and so Benson just hoped that he and Tate would have better luck. He pulled his car down the street and headed west, winding his way through Graham. The third address took them all the way to the outskirts of town, where the streetlights disappeared and the road was suddenly full of potholes. Benson and Tate bounced their way down the uneven road, looking for Randy's house. Benson was beginning to think this was just another wild goose chase when he suddenly slammed on the brakes. The The car skidded to a stop, kicking up a cloud of dirt, because there, right up ahead, was a smoldering pile of rubble where Randy's alleged third home used to be. But all that was left were the remains of a charred foundation. The house had been burnt to the ground, and recently too. Tate climbed out of the car and went to go walk the perimeter of the burned-down home. Benson just leaned on the hood of the car, scratching his head. He was starting to worry that Randy was on the run. By the time Benson and Tate got back to the station, the preliminary results from the medical examiner had arrived, and so Benson sat at his desk looking over the report, and the details of the murder were absolutely depraved. Both Brian and Bev had been shot in the head 3 times at close range with a .22 caliber revolver. But to Benson's surprise, the rape kit used for Beverly came back negative, which meant that she suffered no sexual assault either pre- or post-mortem, despite having been found nude. Benson also had a report from the forensics department, analyzing a palm print lifted from the blood smear on the bedroom door jamb, as well as the bloody shoe print they spotted by the bodies. They hadn't matched the palm print to anybody in the system yet, but they would run the prints against any that Benson collected from suspects, and so Benson really needed to find Randy Holmes. But before he could even start to formulate a new plan, Benson's phone rang. And when he answered, he was shocked, because the voice on the other line belonged to none other than his #1 suspect, Randy Holmes. Randy said his mom told him that Detective Benson was looking for him. She hadn't said what it was about, but he'd heard about the murders of Brian and Beverly, and he figured it had to be related. He said he was staying with a friend about 10 miles away and wanted to come in and clear his name. Randy swore he had an alibi for the night of the murder, along with several friends who could back up his story. Now, Benson had not been expecting this. So, pretty aggressively, he asked Randy for the names and phone numbers of these so-called friends because he was going to call each and every one of them and ask them questions about Randy's alibi. Benson was hoping that the way he was asking, being sort of aggressive on purpose, would maybe get Randy to flinch, or maybe refuse to give him contact information to show he was guilty. But Randy reacted by saying, yeah, that's fine, all good. And then he encouraged Benson to make those calls, call all of them. And so Benson scribbled down the information as Randy rattled off a handful of names. Then, Benson asked Randy point blank, did he steal a gun and a phone from the Mox house on the day of the football watch party? This was a test to see if Randy would lie. But Randy didn't hesitate. Yes, he said. Yes, he did. He said he knew all of this made him look horrible, but he swore he did not hurt Brian or Beverly. Trying hard not to be completely thrown off by Randy's apparent honesty, Benson asked for the address where Randy was currently staying. He told Randy he was going to send Tate over to check out the stolen gun to see if it matched the weapon that killed Brian and Beverly. And Randy eagerly gave him the address. He told him the gun was with him right now and he'd be waiting for Detective Tate. Benson hung up and just sat there for a minute, absorbing this new twist. Then he stood up and walked across the room to Tate's desk. He handed over the address and asked him to go check it out. Then Benson got to work calling all of Randy's friends. An hour later, Benson sat dejectedly at his desk, sipping lukewarm coffee and skimming through his notes on the case so far. He just hung up with the last of Randy's friends, all of whom had confirmed that they were with Randy at a party on the night of the murder. Benson knew they could be lying to cover for their friend, but they all gave intricate details about the party, and all of those details matched. Their accounts were too nuanced and too overlapping to be lies. Benson had to reconcile the fact that Randy's whereabouts were accounted for during the murder. Just a few hours ago, he thought this case was basically solved. Now, he was back to square one. Just then, his phone rang. Benson answered and heard Tate's voice. He said he was at Randy's house and he had some more bad news. The stolen gun was not a match. Benson sighed and said, yep, he had a feeling that was going to be the case. Benson took another sip of coffee, and he began to sift through more documents in the case file. He grabbed the interview that Tate conducted with Brian and Beverly's neighbor, the guy who lived in the trailer across the field, Daniel Tavares, who had seen the two men running out of the Mox house. Benson wondered if he should go speak to Daniel again, just to see if maybe he remembered any other details that could help them crack the case. Or maybe Benson thought he should send Tate out to canvass again, this time asking neighbors if they recognized the man from Daniel's description, the guy with the ponytail and the pockmarked face. But whatever he decided to do, it was going to have to wait until tomorrow. This was only the first day of the investigation, and it was late. Benson and Tate both needed to go home and get some sleep. The next morning, on Sunday, Sergeant Benson climbed into the cockpit of a single-engine plane at the airstrip in Graham. He hoped that by flying over the monk's home, it could help him sort of reframe the evidence and show him what clues he could be missing. Benson glided through the blue skies, reviewing the details of the case in his mind over and over again. The door was kicked in, the victims' bodies were piled on top of one another and covered with a sheet. Their friend Justin was at the scene around the time of the murders, but claimed that everything seemed normal until he came back hours later. Randy Holmes technically had a motive, but no murder weapon and a decent alibi. And the neighbor saw two men running out of the monk's home around 7 a.m., one with a pockmarked face and the ponytail. What was he missing? Benson finally reached the monk's home and looked down from the cockpit. Even at this height, he could clearly see the yellow caution tape lining their property. Benson scanned all around the sparsely populated neighborhood below, quickly spotting Daniel Tavares' trailer parked across the field. He saw a trailer park even further down the road. Brian's friend Justin lived close, and Randy's mom's house wasn't that far away either. And as Benson was sort of staring around at all the places he had been on the ground with his partner, he noticed something he had totally overlooked while he was on the ground. He turned the plane around and headed right back to the airstrip. He now needed just one more piece of physical evidence and one more interview, and then he was certain he would be able to solve this case. Less than an hour later, Benson stood outside the sheriff's station as a squad car pulled up with his interview subject inside. Not because his subject was under arrest, they just didn't have a car, and so needed a ride to the station. It had just rained out, and Benson watched as his subject stepped out of the cruiser and splashed through puddles to the station door to meet him. Benson thanked his subject again for agreeing to talk, and then led them inside. While Benson walked with the subject deeper into the station to an interview room, Detective Tate passed by them on his way towards the front door. As Benson opened up the interview room door and he and his subject began to go inside, Detective Tate reached the front door, stopped, and bent down. By the time Benson was actually sitting down opposite his subject inside of that room, Tate, out near the front door, was standing back up and smiling. Based on evidence and interviews collected over the course of 2 days by the Pierce County Sheriff's Department, this is what authorities believe happened to Brian and Beverly Mock on the morning of November 17, 2007. The killer arrived at Brian and Beverly's house early in the morning, a .22 caliber revolver in hand. They were furious because they felt like Brian had disrespected them, and the killer did not let anyone disrespect them, not even their own mother. The killer walked up to the front door and knocked, but even though they could hear the TV on inside, nobody answered. So suddenly, in a rage, the killer just kicked in the door and stormed inside. From inside the house, Brian looked up in total shock, but the killer didn't hesitate. They raised their gun and fired. The first bullet struck Brian in the side of the head, and he crumpled to the ground, but the killer wasn't done. They walked over to Brian's body and fired 2 more shots directly into the back of Brian's head. The killer was about to leave, but they heard footsteps coming down the hallway. The killer looked up to see Beverly, completely naked, her face frozen in terror. She screamed and ran for the front door, but the killer fired 2 more shots, and both struck her in the back of the head. She fell. The killer stalked over to her, pressed the gun to her forehead, and pulled the trigger 1 more time. Then they dragged her lifeless body over to her husband's and stacked her right on top. It was only then that the killer looked around and saw the blood all over the house and realized what a mess they had made. They flicked on a few lights to see what they were doing, then went to the kitchen to find some cleaning supplies. The killer found a broom and tried their best to wipe up the blood on the floor with it, but it didn't do any good. It just smeared the blood around, creating these long, thin streaks across the blood trail that would later confuse detectives. The killer realized they had to get creative, so they went into the master bedroom looking for extra blankets. As they walked through the threshold, they grabbed the door jamb, leaving behind a bloody smear. Then they opened up the closet and found a spare sheet. They carried it back out to the living room and used it to cover Brian and Beverly's bodies. The killer turned off all the light switches they had turned on and then tried to wipe the blood off those switches, and then, feeling satisfied, they headed for the front door. But on their way, they stepped on the sheet, leaving behind a telltale shoe print of blood. Later that morning, a detective from the Pierce County Sheriff's Department would show up at the killer's front door, asking questions about Brian and Beverly Mock. But unbeknownst to any of the detectives, the killer had a dark and horrifying criminal past, and their many experiences with the police had turned them into a very good liar. So the killer was ready with a story, a story that the police would believe for a full 24 hours. That is, until Detective Benson flew his plane over the crime scene and realized that story was physically impossible. That flight, that discovery, would trigger one more interview, and the subject was the killer. And because it had just rained when they walked through the entryway of the police station to the interview room, the killer would leave a shoe print on the station floor that Detective Tate would find. And that print would match the bloody footprint found at the crime scene. The killer was Brian and Beverly Mock's neighbor, Daniel Tavares. From the air, Benson had realized that Daniel's story about seeing two men running out of the Mock's house was actually impossible, because from the air, he could clearly see that Daniel's home was simply too far away from the Mock's home to actually see that. And so as soon as Benson made this realization, he rushed to the police station and summoned Daniel in for an interview. He also ran Daniel's name through the computer system looking for a criminal record. And what he found would go on to shock the entire country. Because Daniel Tavares had been released from a prison in Massachusetts only a few months earlier after serving 16 years for stabbing his own mother to death. Daniel was not supposed to leave the state of Massachusetts, but he had, and he fled to Washington, and no one from Massachusetts had come to look for him. So Daniel was technically already on the run from the law when he murdered the Mocks. And yet, Daniel was so confident in his lie that when he went to the police station to be interviewed that last time, which would also be the day he would be arrested, he wore the same boots that he had on at the time of the murder. However, once Benson finally confronted Daniel with all the police knew, including the fact they had matched the print he had left in the station to the one at the crime scene, Daniel would confess to the murders. He claimed he had done it because Brian apparently owed him $50 and also had somehow disrespected him. Daniel was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. This episode was written by Zeth Lundy. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Cole Lacasio. Additional audio editing by Jordan Stidham. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, the MrBallen podcast, as well as MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, Late Nights with Nexpo, and A Twist of History. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. On a cold winter night in 1999, a man drove down a dark street towards his house in a small Iowa town. As he was driving, suddenly he saw something glowing in his headlights and he slammed on the brakes. He got out of his car, and there, in the lights, he saw a dog standing all by herself, and she was making this soft squeaking sound like she was scared. The man slowly approached her, doing his best to keep her calm as he got close. He knew everybody who lived in this neighborhood, and he had never seen this dog before. He finally reached the dog, and she seemed very scared, and he pet her a couple of times and, still tried to keep her very calm, and as he looked her over, she didn't seem hurt, and she also didn't have any tags on her. The man looked up and noticed he was actually right near his house, and so he decided he would just lead the dog to his house and figure out what to do with her after that. So he coaxed her, and she followed him right along, and they went inside his home. and over the next few weeks, the man would do his best to try to locate her owner, not realizing that this dog had not just wandered off. In reality, this dog would become the key that police desperately needed to solve a gruesome crime. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please sign up for as many telemarketing calls as you possibly can, but don't use your phone number, use the Follow Button's phone number. Okay, let's get into today's story. On January 20th, 1999, 28-year-old John Helbel sat at a table in his trailer home in the small town of North Liberty, Iowa, staring down at a gun. But this was not just any gun. This was a classic old revolver from the 1950s that had seen better days, and so John was intent on restoring it to its former glory. So he picked up a gunsmith screwdriver, which is a small screwdriver with a hollow ground tip, and slowly began taking pieces of the revolver apart. Then, once he had done that, he began cleaning the pieces and removing rust that had collected over the years. John knew restoring a gun like this, at least restoring it the right way, would be slow, painstaking work, and that's actually one of the reasons he loved doing it so much. John had a collection of over 40 classic and customized guns, and when he was working on them, it felt like the rest of the world just disappeared. Somebody could be in the room with him, and he'd forget they were even there. That's how focused he'd become on restoration projects. And staying focused had not always been easy for John. Not long after he had graduated high school and enrolled in college, about 10 years earlier, John had gotten involved with drugs, both as a user and also as a dealer. He was frenetic and all over the place, and so drugs had just caused him a lot of problems. He'd had run-ins with the police, and he'd struggled to hold down a job. But over the last couple of years, he'd really tried to make some changes in his life, and that's where restoring and customizing guns came in. It wasn't really about selling them for money. Instead, it was about having an interest in something that he was really good at, and also that helped him stay calm. It was also something he could do entirely by himself, and John loved being on his own, to the point that some people called him a recluse. He had a small circle of friends and family, but he was known to go days at a time without seeing or calling any of them. Back at the table in his trailer, John looked down at the work that he'd already done on this revolver, and he smiled. It would still take him several more hours, maybe even another full day, to get the gun looking as good as new, but he could already see a huge difference. Still, he figured it was time to stop for now. Because he heard his dog, a 3-year-old black and white Siberian Husky mix named Keisha, barking from the front room of the trailer. That meant she wanted food. And as far as John was concerned, whatever Keisha wanted, she got. John stood up, carefully put the pieces of the gun back in its case, and went to the sink to wash his hands. Then he poured some dog food into a bowl on the floor, and Keisha came running, and John crouched down, scratching behind her ears and talking to her like she was his best friend. Because in reality, she was. In fact, everyone who knew John said he treated Keisha like she was his child. She went with him almost everywhere he went when he left the house, and there were long stretches of time when Keisha was actually the only other living thing that John interacted with. As Keisha ate the food in her bowl, John walked over to a small refrigerator and grabbed a slice of cold pizza. He ripped off a small piece of it, and immediately Keisha turned from her bowl, jumped on top of him, and devoured the human food that John always gave her as an extra treat. When Keisha was done eating the pizza, John walked to a small room at the back of his trailer. This is where he kept his gun collection in several different gun boxes. He opened up a polished wooden box, looking for a spot to put his current project when it was done. And as soon as he did, his face just lit up. Because in this box, he saw his prized possession. A Colt 45 Gold Cup semi-automatic pistol. This was a high-end weapon known for its accuracy and very unique design. And John had customized it further with gold screws and gold flourishes, and he was very proud of the work he had done. Other than his dog and his mom, John said this gun was maybe the most important thing to him in the whole world. John closed the gun box, excited he'd be adding a new piece to the collection soon. Later that night, after taking Keisha for a walk, John sat down at his recliner in the cramped front room of the trailer. and Keisha immediately curled up at his feet. John turned on the TV, and it didn't take long before he had drifted off to sleep. And a few minutes later, he was already sleeping so deeply that he didn't hear the sound of footsteps creaking slowly across the trailer floor. On February 23, 1999, so 34 days after John had fallen asleep watching TV, Detective Douglas Vanoy of the Johnson County Sheriff's Department got a call when he was at his desk. Detective Vanoy heard a woman's voice on the other end, and he could tell right away that she was quite upset. Vanoy asked her how he could help, and the woman told him that she was concerned because she hadn't seen or heard from her son, John Helbel, in over a month. This took Detective Vanoy by surprise. He assumed John's mom was calling to file a missing persons report, but people usually did that when they hadn't heard from a loved one in maybe a few days at the most. So he asked John's mom why she had waited so long to call, and she told him that her son liked keeping to himself, and in fact, it really wasn't unusual for him to go, a week, even 2 at a time, without talking to any of his friends or family. But now it had been over a month, and she'd called him several times, and she hadn't heard back. But she told the detective that she actually did not want to file a missing persons report. Instead, she was hoping the police would meet her at John's trailer to basically go check on him and make sure he was okay. She just had sort of a sinking feeling about this and didn't want to go in there alone. I mean, she figured her son was probably fine, but she just wanted to know for sure, and she just wanted some other people there with her. Vanoy said that was fine. Then he got the address of the trailer and told her he would meet her there. After that, Vanoy hung up and headed out to his car with a deputy. And as he began to drive, the detective thought to himself that no matter what John's mom had said about her son very likely being fine, well, if she's asked the police to join her at the trailer to go inside and take a look, that actually indicates that she must be really worried. A few minutes later, Detective Vanoy and the deputy drove through North Liberty's downtown, and it looked like something from another time, like the shops and restaurants lining the main road had been there forever. Vanoy drove a couple more miles past a stretch of farmland and soon arrived at the Holiday Mobile Home Park that had over 200 trailer homes spread out across acres of land. Vanoy headed down a dirt road through the park that had snow piled up on either side, and after a few minutes, he and the deputy arrived at John's trailer. And right away, they saw John's mom, along with a mobile home park employee waiting for them. They also saw a blue van parked on the dirt drive in front of the trailer. The officers stepped outside of the car. Vanoy thought it was cold, but nothing too bad. It was sort of a typical Iowa winter day, with temperatures a bit over 20 degrees Fahrenheit. John's mom introduced herself and told the detective that she and this employee had actually already tried opening the door, but they found it was locked. And also, nobody was responding from the inside. Vanoy told them, okay, stand back so I can break the door down. But John's mom asked him not to do that. If John really was fine, she didn't want to damage his trailer for nothing. At that point, the employee pointed the officers to a window on John's trailer that would be large enough for them to climb through. Vanoy put on his gloves and checked the window, and he found it was locked, but it was pretty flimsy, and so he managed to pull it open without doing any damage and without much trouble. But as soon as the window was open, Vanoy instantly threw his hands up over his nose and mouth to block the horrific smell coming from the inside. He stepped back and caught his breath, and then told John's mom not to come over there. Then, Vanoy and the deputy kind of braced themselves and went forward and climbed in through the window. Once they got inside, the smell got 10 times worse, and they also immediately saw something strange in the front room of the trailer. There, in the recliner, something large had been completely covered by a blanket. Vanoy held his breath and slowly approached the recliner. He reached out and pulled down the blanket, and right away he kind of flinched. Vanoy was an experienced cop, but he'd never seen anything like this. Sitting upright in the chair was the body of a dead man that had already clearly begun to decompose. However, as gruesome as it was, the man did not appear to have any injuries. It sort of looked like he had fallen asleep and just never woken up again. But as Vanoy walked around the recliner and leaned in closer to the body to get a better look, it quickly became clear that this man had not died of natural causes, because Vanoy noticed 2 small bullet wounds. The detective and the deputy left the recliner and made their way through the few other rooms of the trailer. There was a kitchen, a bedroom, a bathroom, and a small room at the back. But after searching those areas, they didn't really find anything out of the ordinary. the home had not been ransacked, and there was no sign of forced entry or a struggle of any kind. The only thing Vinoy thought was odd was that there were dog bowls for food and water on the kitchen floor, but no dog, dead or alive. Vinoy called into the sheriff's department and arranged for a county forensics team to come out. He said he had no idea how long the victim had been dead for, but based on the smell and the decomposition of the body, he figured it had been at least a few weeks. After that, Vinoy prepared himself for what he considered to be the worst part of his job. He was pretty sure the dead man on the recliner was John Helbel, but now he needed John's mother to ID the body. Minutes later, John's mother stood in the trailer, fighting back tears. She said that was definitely her son in the recliner. She kept her composure, and in a quiet voice, she told Detective Vinoy that she wanted to do whatever she could to help the police. She said outright that John had not always been perfect. He'd struggled with drugs and had run-ins with the law, but he was a good person, and he always tried to help the people he loved. Vinoy told her he would do everything that he could to bring her and her son justice. He also told her that he knew how difficult it was for her to be here in this trailer right now. But he needed to know if there was anything in the trailer that looked sort of out of place to her. And John's mom didn't hesitate. She said John's dog, Keisha, was missing, and that he loved that dog possibly more than anything else in the world. The deputy took notes on Keisha's breed and appearance. Then Detective Vinoy walked with John's mom through the trailer and asked if there was anything else that stood out. John's mom went through the kitchen and into the small back room. And after looking around for a moment, she turned to Vinoy and said something else was off here. Somebody had robbed John of his entire gun collection, which was very valuable. Vinoy asked if there was a chance that John had maybe just sold all of his guns since the last time she had seen him, but John's mom shook her head. She said even if he had sold the collection, there was one gun he would never get rid of, his customized Colt 45 Gold Cup pistol. She told Vinoy that John would sometimes say if anybody wanted that gun, they would have to pry it from his cold, dead hands. Later that day, the county forensics team arrived and began collecting blood samples and fingerprints from the trailer. While that was going on, Detective Vinoy and the deputy searched John's blue van out front, but the only thing they found inside was a dog leash. The detective didn't know if this meant that John had taken Keisha somewhere before he got killed, or if he simply just kept a leash in his van. Then, Vinoy and the deputy made their way around the mobile home park and began speaking to John's closest neighbors. But none of them remembered hearing gunshots or anything out of the ordinary over the past few weeks, and they all basically said the same thing. John was a nice guy, but he mostly kept to himself. And so at this point, Detective Vinoy didn't really have much to go on to start this investigation in earnest. He basically needed to wait for the forensics report or the autopsy to get something concrete. And so while he waited for those things, he just hoped that Keisha would turn up. On Friday, February 26th, so 3 days after John's body was discovered, Keisha had still not shown up. However, Vinoy did now have a copy of the autopsy and the forensics report. Unfortunately, though, neither of them gave him very much to go on. The autopsy concluded that John had been killed with a .22 caliber pistol, and Vinoy knew that a lot of .22s don't make very much noise, so that could explain why none of the neighbors heard anything. And then because of the level of decomposition of John's body, the medical examiner couldn't determine an exact date of death. But he believed John had been dead for over a month. And beyond the blood samples from John's wounds and small amounts of blood on the recliner, the forensics team had not found much else. So, Vinoy had a crime scene with very little concrete evidence, where the door had been locked, yet there were no signs of struggle or forced entry, and John's beloved dog and his gun collection were missing. All of this led Vinoy to believe that John had likely been killed by someone he was close with, close enough that he would welcome them into his trailer and who would have known about the gun collection. However, everyone the detective had spoken to said John basically didn't have friends. He was a loner. And so at this point, Vinoy knew this was not going to be an easy case. And also, North Liberty, Iowa was a small town with a population of just over 5,000 people. And so a murder in such a small town like that could quickly lead to massive panic in the community, which meant there was going to be a lot of pressure to find a way to solve this difficult case very quickly. But as Vinoy sat there getting more and more frustrated thinking about this case, a deputy rushed over to his desk, and this young officer had a really excited look on his face. He told Detective Vinoy that he was almost positive he had just found John's dog, Keisha. Vinoy didn't waste any time. He got the location of the dog from the deputy, and then he called John's mother and asked her to go meet him at that location. Vinoy headed out to his car and sped across town to a house in a small neighborhood just a few miles from John's trailer. John's mom arrived soon after, and the two of them went to meet with the man who lived in the house. As soon as they stepped inside, an excited black and white Siberian Husky mix rushed over and greeted John's mom. John's mom pet the dog and got tears in her eyes and said yes, this was definitely Keisha. Detective Vinoy asked the man how he had come to find Keisha, and the man told him he actually found Keisha over a month ago. It was after midnight on January 21st. He said he remembered this specific date because the whole thing was just so odd. He said he had come home that night and saw the dog standing in the middle of the street right near his house. The dog didn't have any tags, and the man didn't recognize her from the neighborhood. But what had really stood out to him was that the dog, despite being out in the elements, was totally clean, like immaculately clean. This seemed really weird to Vinoy too. I mean, it was winter in Iowa. The ground was covered in snow, and the dirt roads outside of town, like where he was describing finding her, were soaking wet and muddy. If Keisha had gotten out of her trailer and wandered a few miles to this location, her fur almost certainly would have been a mess. Now, this story to Vinoy did seem sort of far-fetched, but at the same time, he really had no reason to doubt this guy. I mean, he seemed like he was being very truthful and forthcoming about how this dog came to be in his possession. And so for now, Vinoy decided he would just simply believe him, and he would operate on what this guy was saying. Which meant, if this is really how Keisha was found, well then either John's killer, or an accomplice of the killer, must have driven Keisha here and left her right here on the street. Otherwise, how else could she be so clean? When Vinoy got back to the sheriff's station later that day, he called the crime lab and told them they had located Keisha. He also said he thought the dog had been driven from John's trailer and dumped sometime early on January 21st. So he now believed John had most likely been killed, maybe late on the 20th. The forensics officer he spoke to said that the dog being driven somewhere was actually great news, because a dog's nose print is like a human fingerprint. Each one is unique. So if Vinoy could nail down a suspect, a forensics team could search their car to see if there was any trace of Keisha's nose print on the windows or the interior. Now, Detective Vinoy felt like finding Keisha was a huge deal for this case, but it was no good if he couldn't track down any viable suspects. I mean, the first thing he did is he contacted the man who had found Keisha, and they searched his car to see if, maybe there were prints inside of his car that suggested he was lying about how he found Keisha. But no. It was totally clean, the guy was incredibly truthful, basically made himself fully available to the investigation, and so he was quickly ruled out. And beyond him, there was nobody in the neighborhood where Keisha had been found that had seen anybody drop her off or had any recollection of seeing a car that looked out of place. It was like nobody knew anything. Keisha had just suddenly appeared. So, Vinoy decided to reach out again to everybody he'd already spoken to, John's mom and his neighbors. Vinoy believed that even if John was a recluse, somebody had to know at least one friend of his. And this time, one of John's neighbors did remember something important. The man told Vinoy that he had seen a truck at John's trailer over a month earlier, right around the last time he had seen John. The man was sure that that truck belonged to one of John's few friends, a guy in his 20s named Mike Harding. And after a quick search through police criminal records, Detective Vinoy discovered that, just like John, Mike had a history of using and selling drugs. At the end of February, so a few days after police had found John's dog Keisha, Detective Vinoy sat down with Mike Harding in a small interview room at the sheriff's station. Going into this, Vinoy had no idea what to expect. He knew that Mike had at one point gotten mixed up with drugs and had some trouble with the law in the past, but it really wasn't anything major. It wasn't like Mike was some big-time felon dealer or something. Also, Vinoy had no idea what kind of person someone as reclusive as John would consider a friend. Like, what's Mike gonna be like here? But right away, Detective Vinoy felt like Mike was very outgoing and that he wanted to help. Mike said that he and John were close friends, even if they didn't hang out a whole lot. He openly admitted that yes, they both had had issues with drugs and made mistakes in the past. But he said John was a really good guy, and he couldn't imagine why anybody would want to hurt him. Vinoy asked Mike if he thought it was possible that John might have fallen deeper into the drug scene than Mike maybe realized. Was it possible he'd gotten in trouble with some dangerous people? But Mike said there was no way. Maybe John still smoked weed, but he was not connected to major drug dealers or anything crazy like that. Vinoy thought Mike came off like he was telling the truth, but he'd been a cop long enough to know that some people were just good liars. So he asked if Mike would be willing to take a polygraph test. And Mike didn't hesitate. He said if that would help, he'd happily do it. Before Vinoy wrapped up their interview and took Mike to go take this polygraph test, he said to Mike that he needed to know if there was anybody else he could think of that John might have been hanging out with around the time he was killed back in January. Mike thought about it for a second, and then he looked up and said, yeah, there were definitely two people the police needed to speak to. A man named Andy Rich, who'd been John's friend for years, and Andy's girlfriend, Sharon Snyder. Mike said the two of them lived far away in Wyoming now, but they had come to visit John back in January, and Mike said he had not seen or heard from John since the two of them had left. In early March, so just a few days after his interview with Mike, Detective Vinoy left the small town of Northern Liberty, Iowa, and flew about 1,000 miles away to another small town called Graybull, Wyoming. And after meeting with local police there, Vinoy caught a huge break. Local police were already in the process of securing a search warrant for Andy and his girlfriend's residence, connected to an unrelated drug investigation. So after they got that warrant, which was very quick, Vinoy simply accompanied them when they executed the search on the residence. And as soon as the door opened up, Vinoy got a look at Andy and Sharon, and the first thing he noticed was that they seemed a lot older than John. John was 28, and Andy and Sharon appeared to at least be in their 40s. He could also tell that they were totally panicked by the police being there. As the search was going on, Vinoy pulled Andy and Sharon aside and began speaking to them. And during this conversation, Andy would tell Vinoy that, yes, he and Sharon had driven to Iowa back in January, and that he, Andy, had visited John on his own after dropping Sharon off at another friend's house in a nearby town. Andy said that he and his buddy John just hung out for a little while, and then Andy had left, picked up Sharon, and then the two of them had driven back to Wyoming together. Sharon would reiterate the same story. But the whole time they were talking, what Vinoy really noticed about this couple is that they both seemed incredibly nervous. They couldn't stay still, and they kept darting their eyes away from Vinoy, kind of all around the house, like they were looking for something. And when police finished up their search, Vinoy understood why the couple was so freaked out. Because police found inside of their residence a substantial stash of methamphetamine and marijuana. And, more importantly to Vinoy, they also found bullets for a .22 caliber pistol, the same caliber gun used to murder John. The local police began to deal with the drugs they had found. They also bagged up those bullets so they could run some more tests on them to determine if they were the same kind of .22 caliber rounds that had killed John. Detective Vinoy did not have enough evidence yet to try to extradite Andy and Sharon back to Iowa, but he now considered the couple his primary suspects. And just as the police were finishing up inside of the house, a forensics tech came inside and called to Vinoy to come outside and look at something. Vinoy followed the tech outside to Andy and Sharon's car that was parked right out in front, and the tech led him to one of the back windows and pointed to a faint smudge. Vinoy asked what he was looking at, and the tech said that this smudge was clearly a dog's nose print. Vinoy got excited. As strange as it seemed, he felt like this dog's nose print could be the piece of evidence that would solve this case. It could be Keisha's nose print. The tech said he would pull the print and test it to see if it really was Keisha's. And Vinoy felt positive that if the prints were a match, he could prove that either Andy, Sharon, or both of them had driven Keisha on the night of the murder and dropped her off where she was found. And Vinoy was sure whoever had driven Keisha on that night had also killed John. The following day, Detective Vinoy was back in Iowa, feeling confident that his trip to Wyoming would soon pay off in a huge way. But over the next several weeks, as test results started to come in from the crime lab in Wyoming, any excitement he had felt had quickly disappeared. Because the bullets that had been found at Andy and Sharon's place did not match the type of bullets that had killed John. They were the same caliber, but a totally different design. On top of that, the dog's nose print taken from Andy and Sharon's car window was not as complete as they had hoped, so the lab couldn't say one way or the other if it actually matched Keisha's nose. And then also, John's friend Mike had passed his polygraph test. Vinoy knew polygraphs were by no means 100% accurate, but all of a sudden, it was like Vinoy was back to having no clear-cut evidence that pointed to anyone. Vinoy continued to try to track down anybody else who might have been close to John, or who could at least point him in the right direction, but what everybody had already said about John proved to be true. He just wasn't that close to very many people. While Vinoy had hoped John's beloved dog Keisha might be the key to solving this case, he now felt like he had to try going in a totally new direction here. So, he decided to focus on the one thing other than Keisha and his mother that everybody said John truly loved, and that was his customized Colt 45 Gold Cup pistol. Since John had added his own specific touches to this gun, like the gold screws and the gold accents, Vinoy hoped that would make it easier to track it down, because it was very unique. And so Vinoy reached out to numerous law enforcement agencies, local, state, and federal, along with gun stores and pawn shops all across the country, in the hope that somebody would have spotted this prized gun. But this extensive search came up empty. So Vinoy spent several weeks just kind of retracing his steps all over again. He went back to the crime scene and looked around there, and he also re-interviewed all of his main suspects. He spoke to the guy who had found Keisha, he spoke to Mike in Iowa, and he even returned to Wyoming to speak to Andy and Sharon again. But nothing new developed. Soon, months had passed by without any more evidence, leads, or suspects materializing. And since Detective Vinoy worked in a very small department and he was one of the very few detectives, his time and focus were quickly needed for other investigations. But Vinoy never fully abandoned John's case, and he continued his search for the gold-accented gun. But it just no longer could be his only priority. And over time, despite his efforts, Vinoy began to worry that John's murder might never be solved. Fast forward to late December of 2000, almost 2 years after John's murder. Detective Vinoy sat at his desk working a totally different case. Then Vinoy's phone rang. And when he answered, he heard another detective from another city on the line. At first, Vinoy didn't think much of this. Detectives from different jurisdictions often helped each other if they had cases that might be connected. But as this detective spoke, Vinoy almost couldn't believe what he was hearing. Because the other detective said he had just busted somebody for illegally selling guns, and this gun trafficker over the course of their interview had brought up pretty adamantly that they knew about this missing gold Colt 45 gun. Now, this detective didn't really know what they were talking about, but they had looked into it and discovered that Detective Vinoy was in the middle of looking into a murder case that involved a missing gold Colt 45. So he was calling about it. The two detectives spoke for a bit longer about this gun, and then after Vinoy hung up, he felt the type of rush he only felt when he knew he was close to solving a case. The following day, Detective Vinoy and the detective who had called him about this gun sat across from the gun trafficker inside of a cramped interview room in a small police station. Above them, a fluorescent light buzzed and cast a sickly glow over everything. The room just felt tense, and the gun trafficker kept looking back and forth like somebody outside might be watching or listening. But Vinoy and this other detective did their best to keep things as calm as they could, and they explained that any information that led to a murder getting solved would be greatly appreciated by the police and the courts. The gun trafficker nodded. The message was clear. Help the detectives with this murder case and possibly avoid serious jail time for their gun trafficking charges. So, eventually, the gun trafficker gave Vinoy an exact address to visit if he wanted to find this gold Colt 45. And when Vinoy heard this address, he just stared across the table in disbelief. This investigation had started in a little town in Iowa and had already taken him to Wyoming more than once. And now, Detective Vinoy had to pack his bags again and fly down to Dallas, Texas. A few days later, Vinoy and several members of the Dallas Police Department went to the address Vinoy had gotten from the gun trafficker. And there, they met with the man who had supposedly purchased this gold Colt 45 gun. The man was cooperative, but he quickly told them that he actually didn't have the gun anymore. He said he had sold it months ago and had no idea where it was now. After hearing this, Vinoy felt totally defeated, like this trip had been a complete waste of time. But then the man said he actually still had the box that the gold gun had been in when he had bought it. It was a really nice box, so he had kept it for himself. The man went inside and got this box, and when he handed it over, Vinoy looked inside and saw there was a handwritten note. And on this note was a description of the gun that had been sold, and it included all the customizations that had been made to it. And that description absolutely matched John's precious Colt 45. Vinoy thought maybe he could use a handwriting expert to try to prove John had written this note and that the gun that had been sold to this man in Texas was in fact John's gun. But in truth, Vinoy had really hoped that there would be something more definitive here in Texas to connect this gun sale directly to John's killer, whoever it was. And as Vinoy was starting to lose hope that any evidence would come from this trip, he decided to look inside of a small ammunition box that was inside of the actual gun box. And at first, once he looked inside of the small ammo box, it didn't look like there was anything useful inside, just some bullets that may or may not have been used for John's customized gun. But before Vinoy closed the ammunition box, something caught the light, and he stared at it for a second. He waved over another officer, and the two of them just looked at this strange small object in the bottom corner of this small ammo box. Eventually, Vinoy reached in and just lifted up the small ammo box and held it up to the sun to kind of illuminate it with the light. And when he did, he felt like he had just hit a massive jackpot. Because, with this light coming through the box, he could clearly see there was a long strand of white hair tucked inside of this box. And Vinoy felt very confident this hair belonged to a dog. With help from Dallas police, Detective Vinoy collected this piece of hair from the ammunition box and shipped it directly to a woman in California who was one of the few veterinary forensic experts in the country. Using this sample, she was able to run a series of tests, and she determined there was a strong chance that the hair that was found was from the same type of Siberian Husky mix as John's dog, Keisha. As far as Vinoy was concerned, there was no way this was just a big coincidence. So after getting those results, he was sure that whoever had sold the gun to the man in Dallas was the same person who had dropped off Keisha in the neighborhood where she had been found. And armed with this new evidence, Detective Vinoy and his team tracked down the person who had sold the gun in Texas. And after 2 years, they finally knew who had killed John. Based on the dog hair tests, evidence found at the crime scene, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to John Helbel on the night he was killed, January 20th, 1999. The killer stood just inside of the trailer near the front door. Even inside, they could still feel the cold winter air coming through the thin walls. On the other side of the room, in the flickering light of the TV, they saw John, fast asleep in his recliner, with his beloved dog Keisha curled up at his feet. And John and Keisha were facing the killer. The killer, as slowly as they could, reached down and pulled out a .22 caliber pistol from their waistband. After making sure John and the dog had not woken up, the killer began to walk slowly towards John. But after taking a few steps, the floor underneath the killer began to creak, and the killer froze, worried that John might have woken up. But as he stared at John and the dog, neither moved. They were still sleeping. After taking another steadying breath, the killer continued to move, all the way up to the recliner, and then around to the back, behind John. There, the killer raised their gun, placed it right at the back of John's head, and then fired. Blood rushed out of the small wound as John's head slumped forward and rolled to the side, but the killer fired into the back of John's head one more time, just to be sure he was dead. And John did die, right there in his recliner. The killer began to walk back around the chair, but now Keisha was awake, and she was growling. The killer tried to calm the dog down, but she began barking. And the more the killer tried to keep her quiet, the louder Keisha got. The killer thought about shooting the dog, but they just couldn't bring themselves to do it. Instead, they put the gun back in their waistband, rushed to the kitchen, and grabbed the dog leash that was laying on the counter. The killer then put the leash on Keisha, grabbed John's keys that were nearby, and led the dog out to John's blue van. The killer got Keisha into the van, then climbed into the driver's seat and sped out of the mobile home park. A few minutes later, they turned onto a dimly lit street in a quiet neighborhood. They scanned the road, and it was empty. So the killer climbed out, opened the passenger door, took off Keisha's leash, and led her out into the street. As soon as she was out of the van, the killer got right back in and sped back to John's. Once they got there, the killer rushed inside and dropped the keys on the counter. Then they grabbed a blanket on the floor in the front room and used it to completely cover John's body. Then they turned off the TV. After that, they made their way into the back room and picked up all the boxes that held John's gun collection and carried them all out to their own car. Finally, they ran back into the trailer, locked the door from the inside, and then rushed out, closing the door behind them. The killer got into their car, drove a few miles, picked up their girlfriend, and then began the 1,000-mile drive back to Wyoming. John's friend, Andy Rich, was his killer. Andy had been visiting with John, secretly waiting for the right time to kill him. And on the night of January 20th, once John had dozed off in his recliner, Andy felt that time had come. Andy's motive for killing his friend was he simply wanted John's gun collection. Andy believed he could sell a lot of these guns, especially John's prized gold customized Colt 45, for really good money. So he murdered his friend and robbed him. Detective Vinoy actually suspected Andy and his girlfriend Sharon from the moment he met them in Wyoming. Andy had been at John's residence around the time of the murder. The couple had those .22 caliber bullets in their home, and they had that dog's nose print found on the window of their car. But, of course, none of that evidence actually panned out, and so Vinoy had nothing tying either of them directly to the murder. But all of that changed almost 2 years later when Vinoy received that call about the gun trafficker who'd gotten busted for selling guns. It would turn out the detective who had called Vinoy was in Wyoming, and the gun trafficker was Andy's girlfriend Sharon, and Sharon was finally ready to come clean. Vinoy went back to Wyoming to interview Sharon, and she would tell him that she had lied to him during the initial investigation because she was terrified of her boyfriend Andy. She claimed she had no idea that John was dead when Andy had picked her up at her friend's house in Iowa and they had driven back to Wyoming. But she now admitted that soon after they had gotten home from that trip, Andy told her he was now magically in possession of John's favorite gun, the gold Colt 45, and that also Andy was going to be driving down to Texas to meet with a buyer who wanted to buy this gun. And he told Sharon exactly where this buyer lived. By the time Detective Vinoy visited Dallas to go speak to this buyer, he was sure Andy was the murderer. He just needed proof to bolster his case. And that proof came from the dog hair that was found inside of the ammunition box inside of the gun case. Now, Vinoy never actually found John's prized golden gun, but he did have that handwritten note that had been found inside of the gun box. And a handwriting expert would confirm that the writing matched John's. And so, with Sharon's story and the evidence Vinoy found in Texas, he went back to Wyoming and he confronted Andy. And Andy eventually confessed to the murder, simply saying, "I shot John and took his guns." The weapons charges against Sharon got dropped, and she was only given probation for the drugs found inside of her home. Sharon said she was glad that Andy left Keisha alive, but she never actually understood why he'd done it. She said he'd hated that dog, but for some reason, he just couldn't bring himself to harm her. And so it was that decision that ultimately connected him to the murder. After his confession, Andy took a plea deal and was sentenced to 35 years in prison. He was released on parole in 2020. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, of course, the MrBallen podcast, and there's MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, and Late Nights with Nexpo. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature 2 sailing horror stories. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Survivor's Guilt. While sailors are known to have many customs of the sea, there is one custom that is exceptionally dark, and once it begins, there's no going back. And that is the custom we will talk about in this story. And the second and final story you'll hear is called The Kaz 2, and it's about 3 friends' trip of a lifetime that turns into a nightmare. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please go through all of the Amazon Music Follow Button's social media posts and be sure to correct all of their fans' spelling and grammar mistakes in the comments section. Okay, let's get into our first story called Survivor's Guilt. On the morning of February 6th, 1821, 4 young men stood on the deck of a small boat out in the Pacific Ocean. The sun was out, it was beautiful and warm, the water was crystal blue, but none of these 4 men were paying any attention to their surroundings. Instead, all of them were just standing there in total silence, staring at each other. Finally, one of the 4 men spoke up. His name was Owen Coffin, and he was 18 years old. And Owen, like the other 3 men, had grown up on the water. In fact, all 4 of these men had grown up on the small island called Nantucket off the coast of Massachusetts, where the main industry there was whaling, which meant sailors like these 4 men would go out and hunt whales and slaughter them for their oil. So, from the time Owen and the rest of these men were very little, they were out on the water learning how to sail, and they were also learning the customs of the sea. And there was one custom in particular that Owen wanted to talk about right now with the other 3 men. So, in a very serious and hushed tone, Owen asked the question of the other 3 men that sailors referred to as the delicate question. And after Owen asked the so-called delicate question, the other 3 men, who were already very serious and just kind of standing there in silence, suddenly their eyes started to go wide and their mouths went agape. And then again, all of the men just kind of fell into total silence. The only sound they could hear was the splashing of the waves against the side of the boat. The captain of this vessel was a man named George Pollard. He was 28 years old, and he was actually Owen's older cousin. And what George wanted to say to Owen in response to his delicate question was no. But George didn't say that. Instead, he just put his hands up over his mouth and stared kind of incredulously at Owen and the other 2 men who were also teenagers. Their names were George and Barzillai. And as he stared at these other 3 men, he realized that their answers to the delicate question was a resounding yes. They knew it had to be a yes. They had to do this. And even though George could totally override them because he was the captain and so technically in charge, he knew in this situation under this particular custom, he couldn't overrule them. And so, with his hands still over his mouth, George just nodded a yes. Yes, let's go forward with this custom. And so, with a unanimous decision to move forward, Owen slowly reached down and pulled out the ship's logbook from underneath one of the seats behind him. And then he opened up the book and he flipped to the back pages of the logbook, which were totally blank, and he grabbed one of the pieces of paper and he ripped it out of the book. Then Owen began to rip this piece of paper into strips. First, he ripped 3 identically long pieces of paper, and he held up all 3 at the same time to show the others that these are the 3 that are the same. And each of the 3 nodded their head, yes, we see that. And then Owen reached down, he grabbed the paper again, and he ripped a 4th strip out, and this one was dramatically shorter than the other 3. And so Owen held up this much shorter piece, and he showed Charles, George, and Barzillai, and again, they all kind of nodded in agreement. Yes, we see, that's the short piece. And so once the whole group was satisfied that they had their 4 strips, Owen took off his hat, he put all 4 of the strips inside, mixed it around, and held out his hat. It was time. The first man to reach into Owen's hat was Owen's older cousin and the captain, George. He reached in, he pulled one of the strips of paper out, closed it in his fist so he had no idea which one it was, and pulled it back and held it close to his chest. And then one by one, each of the other men did the same thing, reaching in, grabbing their strip, not looking at it, and holding it against their chest. And then once all the strips had been taken, at the exact same time, all 4 men extended their hands into the middle of the circle they were standing in, and they opened their hands palm up to reveal which strip they got. And George, Charles, and Barzillai all had the identical long pieces, and Owen, the 18-year-old, the younger cousin of the captain, the one who had ripped up the strips, he had the short strip. And immediately, when his older cousin, George, saw this, he yelled out, "No, let me take that one." But Owen said, "No, this is customary. I want this." And so after a few moments of the men kind of collecting themselves and calming down, Charles then grabbed the logbook again, flipped to the back of it, pulled out another blank page, and he ripped it into strips again, except now he was only ripping them into 3 strips, 2 long that were identical and 1 short. And once again, as he ripped them, he held them up to show the other men, to show this was a fair process. Then Charles took off his hat, put the 3 strips inside, and extended it to George and Barzillai. Owen was not a part of this round. And so George and Barzillai, one by one, reached in, took their strip, held it to their chest, and then Charles, he would take the last strip, he would hold it to his chest, and then once all the men had their pieces, they held their hands out into the middle of their now smaller circle, they opened their hands, palm up, and this time it would be Charles, the man who ripped up this second round, who would discover he had the short strip. And as soon as Charles saw this, he threw it on the ground, and he ran to the other side of the boat and began screaming, "I can't do this! I can't do it!" Meanwhile, Owen, George, and Barzillai didn't even move or flinch. They just stood there waiting for Charles to calm down. Because they knew he knew this was a very important custom, and once you begin doing it, you can't just stop. Charles would have to come back over and play his role. And so after a few minutes of Charles still kind of calling out that he couldn't do this, tears are coming down his face, he finally wiped the tears, he calmed himself down, and he walked back over to the group, who again, they hadn't moved. George, Barzillai, and Owen, they're just standing there waiting to continue this custom. And so as Charles began coming back over, looking ready to continue, George, without even saying anything, reached down and unlatched a door on the side of the boat. He opened it up, he reached in, and he pulled out this long object that was wrapped in canvas. And then he handed this object to Charles. And then once Charles had possession of this object, Owen, the man who had first drawn the short piece of paper, said to the group, "Now it's time for a moment of silence," even though at this point none of the men were talking. But still, they formed a tight circle with Charles holding this object, and they all bowed their heads, and they just stood there in total silence. And then, once Owen raised his head, the other 3 did as well, and Owen, one by one, touched the shoulders of each of the men and reminded them that this had been a fair process. Then, without saying another word, Owen turned away from the group, he walked over to the edge of the boat, looking out over the water, he got down on his knees, he made sure his posture was good, and he looked out over the water. Owen had always loved the ocean, even though his own father had died out at sea. But this particular whaling expedition that Owen had been on, he thought went extremely well, and he was very proud of what they had all accomplished. And Owen was especially proud to be a part of this particular custom. This custom was one that so few people ever took part in, but all sailors knew about it. It was kind of like the forbidden custom. And here he was playing a central role, which really required a lot of strength. And so feeling very proud of himself, Owen, after looking out over the water for a few more moments, he bent down and put his chin on the edge of the boat, which signaled to Charles it was time. And then once Charles saw that Owen was in position, he stepped away from George and Barzillai and walked over to Owen, carrying this object wrapped in canvas. And then once he was right behind Owen, without saying a word to him, he unwrapped the object. And it was a rifle. And once the rifle was uncovered, he placed the barrel against the back of Owen's head, and then he fired a shot. And instantly, Owen slumped to the ground, dead, and Charles kind of staggered back and fell on the deck and let out this strangled scream. He couldn't believe what he had just done, but he knew there was no other choice. Once they decided to do this sacred custom, they had to take it to the end. And so George, who had just witnessed the execution of his younger cousin, was deeply troubled and pained, but he too knew they had to bring this custom to the finish line, which meant it was George's turn to step forward and play his part. And so George walked up to his now dead younger cousin, and George pulled out a serrated knife and cut off Owen's head. And then once Owen's head was removed, he placed it on the deck, so Owen's face was looking away from the other men, like he couldn't see what they were going to do. And then once the head was in place, George went back to Owen's body and began cutting him open and pulling his organs out and handing them to Charles and Barzillai. George also began cutting off long strips of Owen's flesh, creating sort of like fillets. And then, even though there was a spot on the boat to have a fire, the three men decided they just could not wait. And before long, the only sound that could be heard on board this little boat floating out at sea on the Pacific Ocean was the sound of Charles, George, and Barzillai tearing into Owen's raw flesh with their teeth, turning their beards bright red with his blood. The delicate question that Owen asked the other men at the beginning of this story was one of the most feared questions amongst sailors. And it was only asked if there was a shipwreck or some sort of emergency that happened out at sea, which meant the group had almost no chance of survival. Only in those circumstances was the delicate question appropriate. And what it was, do we draw lots to determine which one of us dies so the other can eat them in order to have a better chance at survival? And so during that first round, when Owen had drawn the short strip of paper, that determined he would be the one who was murdered and eaten. And then in the second round, when Charles drew the short strip of paper, that meant he would be the one to kill Owen. On February 6th, 1821, the day that Owen posed the delicate question, he and the other three men had been lost at sea for the past 3 months after a whale had struck the side of their whaling boat and left them adrift with almost no food and no water. There had been other men on board the Essex who had died from starvation and exposure, and their bodies had been consumed by the surviving sailors until on February 6th, they were down to just these 4 men and no more bodies to eat. Which is why they decided it was time. They had to ask the delicate question. 17 days after Owen sacrificed himself so the others could eat him, another boat happened to drift past the stranded Essex boat, which now only contained Charles and George. Barzillai had died of starvation 5 days after they killed Owen, and Barzillai had been eaten by George and Charles as well. And as this other ship passed by the Essex, and they looked on board, all they saw were skeletons of the men that had died and been eaten, and Charles and George were on opposite ends of the boat, curled up in a ball, chewing on human finger bones, trying to get the last bits of flesh off. And their bodies were totally emaciated, their hair and their beards were wild, they looked totally feral. And then, when this boat actually came up alongside the Essex and boarded to rescue Charles and George, Charles and George looked terrified. It was like they had totally lost their grip on reality. They had been lost at sea for 94 days and had consumed all of their friends, and so it makes sense they might go kind of crazy. But after this crew was able to get Charles and George fed and get them water and cleaned up, they kind of regained their composure and their sanity, and they were very thankful and happy to be alive. The story of what happened to the crew of the Essex quickly spread all around the world, and in fact, it served as inspiration for Herman Melville to write his classic American novel, Moby Dick. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Kaz 2. A little after 7 a.m. on the morning of April 15th, 2007, 3 men launched a 35-foot white catamaran called the Kaz 2 from a marina in northeastern Australia, kicking off what was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime. The captain of the Kaz 2 was 56-year-old Des Batten, and for months he'd been training for this trip. And the 2 friends that Des was bringing with him on this trip were Jim Tunstead, who was 63 years old, and Jim's brother, Peter Tunstead, who was 69 years old. All 3 of the men had spent a lot of time plotting their actual course they'd be going on, which was from this marina on the northeastern side of Australia, up and around the north side, and then down the western coast to Perth, which was their final destination and where all 3 men lived. In total, this trip was supposed to take 8 weeks, and all 3 men were absolutely giddy with excitement at the prospect of spending an entire 2 months basically just drinking beers and fishing. Now, Des, Jim, and Peter were not the types to blow off responsibility to go party. I mean, they were devoted family men. All of them had been married for 30 plus years. Des had 2 kids, Jim had 4 kids, and Peter had 5 kids. But they were all either retired or nearing retirement, and this trip was going to be kind of a way to celebrate the end of an era. And while all 3 of them had gone on other big sailing trips, this one easily was the biggest one in terms of the distance they were covering and how much prep went into it and how expensive it was. I mean, this was like 10x the scope and scale of any other sailing trip they had done. And so, on April 15th, 2007, shortly after the 3 men had launched their boat and kicked off this big trip, Peter's wife would call him just to see how it was going. And she would say, Peter was in great spirits, and she could hear the other 2 men laughing in the background, and it sounded like they were about to start fishing and maybe have a couple of beers. And so it seemed very much to Peter's wife like this trip was going as well as it could be so far. And so eventually, Peter told his wife that he had to go, he told her he loved her, and then they hung up. Now, Des, who was the captain of the Kaz 2, was adamant about safety being the top concern for this trip. Even though all 3 men were relatively healthy and had a lot of sailing experience, and even though Des was a member of a volunteer marine rescue group and so literally could be called on to go perform rescues at sea, despite all this experience and know-how, before they kicked off this trip, Des made Jim and Peter go through all these man overboard drills on the Kaz 2 to make sure they knew how to do it, if for some reason, an emergency arose out at sea. And so the men got really comfortable using all the life-saving equipment and going over all the procedures. And then also when they charted their course, Des stressed that at no point should they be sailing into open water. They needed to stay close to shore the whole time just because it was safer. And so when Jim began filming a video around 10 a.m. on the day they set sail for this trip, you can clearly see the shore in the background of this video, so they're following the course they had planned. But a couple of hours after Jim had shot that video on the day they left, a woman named Isabel Wheeler, who did not know Des, Jim, or Peter and had never seen the Kaz 2 before, she was fishing in an area called Champagne Bay, when she looked out into the water and she saw the Kaz-2, a white 35-foot catamaran, sailing east to west across the horizon. And then at some point, as Isabel was watching this boat, which really meant nothing to her, she just happened to be watching it, she saw it make a quick 90-degree turn and began sailing out towards the open ocean away from the coastline. Now, remember, Isabel knows nothing of this boat or its occupants, and so has no idea that Des, Peter, and Jim had been so clear about, at no point will we sail into the open ocean. It's too dangerous. Stay close to shore. She didn't know that. And so she just saw a ship turning and sailing out to the open water, and she thought, okay, whatever. So she didn't go and report what she saw. It was only later on, when details emerged about what happened on the Kaz-2, that she would later come forward and say, hey, I saw that boat and this is what they did. The next day, April 16th, 2 more people would spot the Kaz-2. These were 2 men who also did not know Des, Peter, Jim. They didn't know Kaz-2. They didn't know Isabel. In fact, these 2 men didn't know each other, but independently on this day, they looked out near Champagne Bay and they saw the Kaz-2 sailing east to west in the exact same spot that Isabel had seen it the day before. Now, remember, the Kaz-2 was traveling from that marina on the northeast side of Australia all the way around to Perth. It was a point A to point B trip. There was no reason the Kaz-2 would ever double back and be in the same place 24 hours later, but here we were 24 hours later, and 2 more people are seeing the Kaz-2 in the same place that Isabel had seen it, and so that made no sense. But again, these 2 men who saw the Kaz-2, they just saw it and thought nothing of it because they don't know anything about this boat. It wasn't until later that they eventually came forward with what they saw. Then, one more day after that, on April 17th, there were these fishermen that were out in their boats a little farther north of Champagne Bay, where Isabel and the 2 other men had seen the Kaz-2 on consecutive days. And these fishermen, they spotted the Kaz-2. And again, these fishermen do not know the Kaz-2. They don't know its occupants. They're just seeing this ship. Except this time, the fishermen, when they saw the Kaz-2, they thought something was wrong. Because they saw the Kaz-2 from a distance, navigating its way fairly close to shore in an area that these fishermen knew was full of coral reefs. It's a very dangerous area to be piloting any ship. In addition, the sail of the Kaz-2 was totally ripped to shreds. And so the fishermen, they're looking at the ship, wondering what they're doing, but the pilot of the ship looked so in control as he's navigating his way through the coral reefs that the fishermen thought, okay, he knows what he's doing, so, leave him alone. But again, later on, they would report what they saw. It wasn't until the next day, April 18th, so 3 days after Des, Peter, and Jim had set sail, that anybody realized there was an issue with the crew of the Kaz-2. Because on April 18th, a Coast Watch surveillance helicopter was flying over the Great Barrier Reef, and they looked down and they saw the Kaz-2 with its badly damaged sails, piloting all around this very dangerous part of the water to be piloting. And so the crew on board the helicopter attempted to radio down to the Kaz-2 to see if they were okay, but no one from the Kaz-2 called back to the helicopter. And so as they're waiting for a response from the Kaz-2, the helicopter crew is watching the pilot of the Kaz-2 clearly, navigating the boat in between coral reefs. And it seemed like, despite the damage to the sails, he knew what he was doing. And so to the crew on the helicopter, this didn't really look like an emergency, but it seemed like something worth flagging. And so they called the Marine police and said, hey, we have this ship here that's not responding. We think they're okay, but you might want to come take a look. And so the Marine police, they would come out to the area where the helicopter had said they had seen the Kaz-2, and when they got there, the Kaz-2 was gone. At this point, the Marine police got some information about the boat, Kaz-2, and discovered who owned the boat and who was on this trip, so Des, Peter, and Jim, and the police would get in touch with all of their families, and they would all tell police that besides Peter's wife, who talked to Peter on that morning they left, no one had heard from any of the men. They had gone totally silent since that first day. And so when police heard this, they knew this had to be some kind of emergency, and so a search was launched to find the Cas-2. And 48 hours later, a rescue helicopter that was part of the search was about 80 or so miles off the northeastern coast of Australia when they looked down and they spotted the Cas-2. And it still had all torn up sails, and it was kind of spinning listlessly in the water, and from the helicopter, they couldn't see anybody on board the ship. It was totally vacant on the deck. Now, at this point, authorities really have no idea what's going on with this boat or its occupants. It was possible that maybe they had been hijacked, and so Des, Peter, and Jim could be held hostage down below, along with the people that took them hostage. Or maybe the boat just got stolen, and Des, Peter, and Jim are not on this boat, and that it's just the criminals on board, and again, they're down below, hidden from view. So authorities, they don't know, but they decided to take a risk and just send somebody down to get on that boat and just see what was going on. So a rescue officer on board the rescue helicopter named Corey Benson was lowered by a rope where he was dropped into the water, and then Corey swam by himself over to the Cas-2 and he climbed up the side of the boat and he stepped onto the deck, and right away he noticed it was kind of like eerily quiet on board the boat. There was nobody he could see, and there was no sign of any disturbance minus the sails of the ship being all tattered. And for a second, Corey thought about maybe calling out for Des, Peter, and Jim to see if they were down below and could come up and solve this mystery. Then he also worried that if he called out, there could be some bad people on board this boat, and he didn't want to draw their attention. And so Corey was quiet and just began walking towards the front of the boat, and as he did, he began to notice signs that people must have recently been on board this boat doing normal things. Like, for example, there was a fishing rod that was cast out into the water that was anchored to a post on the side of the boat that looked like it had just been operated minutes ago. There was a blue mug of coffee that was just sitting on a table that looked like maybe someone had been drinking from it recently. There was a neatly folded t-shirt on another chair with a set of glasses on them. I mean, there was just all these kind of tells that this was a boat that was being used recently. And when Corey actually got to the front of the boat where the captain would stand, he saw the engine was actually still on. It was idling. And so Corey turned it off. Now, at this point, Corey knew his next step was going down the stairs and opening up the door that led into the cabin down below to see if Des, Peter, and Jim were down there. But he also knew when he went down there, despite there being backup up in the helicopter and more people making their way out here, Corey would be all alone if there were criminals or bad people down there. But this was his job. And so after taking a deep breath, he turned and walked down the few steps, and he got to the door that led to the cabin. He grabbed the handle and he opened it up. And the room he was walking into was kind of like a half living room, half kitchen area. And he saw there was this table, and on it was a newspaper that was dated April 15th, so the day the Cas set sail. And then on the wall behind the newspaper was a calendar where days had been marked off all the way through April 14th. April 15th was not marked off. But also nearby on a table was a computer that was still plugged in and on and looked very much like someone had just been using it. And also there were plates of food that were out that didn't look that old that also seemed like people must have just been eating from them. And then also Corey could see past this common area into the bedroom, and very obviously the bunks inside of there had been slept in. And so basically everything seemed like it was where it should be. There was just one problem. Des, Peter, and Jim were not on this ship. There was no sign of where they were. They were just gone. And there was nobody else on board the ship. It was just completely abandoned with no sign of what happened. Des, Jim, and Peter were never found. And so we have no idea what actually happened to them. Nor do we have any idea why they were seen by Isabel and the two men and the fishermen doing all these weird things like randomly piloting out towards open water, which totally went against their plan, which was stay close to shore, be safe. Or, why on that second day they were seen in the same spot near Champagne Bay, indicating they had doubled back after going towards open water. That went against their plan, which was point A to point B. Why are they doubling back around? And so unfortunately, this whole thing is just one big mystery that has yet to be solved. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. This podcast, the MrBallen podcast, and also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, and Redacted. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts to find all of these shows. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.